Some men kill for pleasure. Others kill for science. Boris Gusakov did both and called it progress. In the frozen laboratories of Soviet Russia, one man turned human bodies into experiments and screams into data. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the Siberian butcher, when evil wore a scientist's coat. The scalpel moved with surgical precision across living flesh, but this wasn't surgery. It was systematic annihilation dressed in a white coat. Deep in the restricted zones of 1970s Siberia, where the permafrost kept secrets frozen and state secrecy kept questions silent, a monster masqueraded as a medical professional. Boris Gusakov didn't hunt in shadows or alleys like common predators. He hunted in fluorescent-lit rooms that smelled of formaldehyde and fear, where his victims arrived unconscious and left in pieces. His laboratory became a slaughterhouse. His research papers became obituaries. And for years, the Soviet machine protected him, because admitting his existence meant admitting their complicity. This is the story of the man who weaponized medicine, who turned healing hands into instruments of torture, and who proved that the most terrifying monsters don't hide in darkness. They hide behind credentials, institutional walls, and the blind eye of bureaucracy. Tonight, we descend into the nightmare of Boris Gusakov, the physician who prescribed death. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Thank you. Leningrad, 1948. The city still bore the scars of the siege. Crumbling buildings like broken teeth against a gray sky, survivors walking streets that had become mass graves, and an entire generation learning that human life could be measured in bread rations and frozen corpses. Boris Gusakov came of age in this landscape of normalized horror, where death wasn't an aberration but a daily reality. While other children played in rubble, young Boris collected things: insects, small animals, anything he could dissect with stolen kitchen knives. His mother called it curiosity. His teachers called it promising. No one called it what it was: the budding fascination of a sadist finding his medium. The Gusakov family occupied a cramped apartment in the Vasilievsky Island district, 3 generations squeezed into 2 rooms that never seemed to get warm. Boris's father, Mikhail, had returned from the Eastern Front with shrapnel still lodged in his spine and a drinking problem that made him mean. His mother, Tatiana, worked double shifts at a textile factory, her fingers bleeding from the looms, her spirit crushed under the weight of Soviet survival. Between them, they created a home environment that oscillated between neglect and violence, fertile ground for something dark to take root. Boris learned early that pain was currency, that control meant survival, and that the weak existed to serve the strong. He watched his father beat his mother with the same detached interest he'd later bring to his experiments. He noted which blows caused which reactions, cataloged the sounds of suffering, studied the mechanics of dominance. By age 12, he'd graduated from insects to neighborhood cats. By 14, he'd perfected the art of inflicting maximum pain while keeping his subjects alive. He documented everything in notebooks written in meticulous Cyrillic script: temperature, time, observations, conclusions. Even then, he was practicing the language of scientific detachment, learning to describe atrocity in clinical terms. School became his sanctuary and his hunting ground. Boris excelled in biology with an intensity that impressed and unsettled his instructors. He memorized anatomical structures with photographic precision, spent hours in the laboratory after classes ended, volunteered for every dissection opportunity. His grades earned him praise. His enthusiasm earned him recommendations. His carefully hidden notebooks, filled with detailed drawings of suffering and methodical notes on pain tolerance, would have earned him institutionalization. But those remained secret, locked in a metal box beneath loose floorboards, visited only in the dead hours when the apartment slept. The Soviet education system, desperate for scientific talent to compete with the West, funneled promising students into specialized programs. Boris's test scores opened doors, admission to the first Leningrad Medical Institute, one of the country's most prestigious institutions. He arrived in 1966, age 18. A thin young man with forgettable features and unforgettable eyes, pale blue, unervingly focused, radiating an intensity that made people look away. His classmates found him off-putting but brilliant. His professors found him dedicated but distant. No one found the truth, that they were educating a predator, giving him tools, legitimacy, and access. Medical school should have satisfied his curiosity about human anatomy. Instead, it inflamed his darker impulses. Cadaver dissection felt like foreplay. The real act required living subjects, reactions, the dynamic interplay of stimulus and response. He craved the forbidden knowledge that only vivisection could provide, the secrets that corpses couldn't tell. But even in the morally flexible Soviet system, openly torturing living humans remained problematic. So Boris learned patience. He learned to hide behind procedure and protocol. He learned that institutional authority could provide cover for almost anything if you knew how to work the system. His dissertation focused on pain response mechanisms in extreme stress conditions, academically respectable, practically sinister. He proposed experiments that pushed ethical boundaries but stayed just barely within the gray zones of Soviet medical research, where desperation for breakthroughs often trumped ethical concerns. His advisor, an old guard researcher who'd survived Stalin's purges by learning not to ask questions, approved the work with minimal scrutiny. The committee passed him with honors. By 1971, Dr. Boris Gusakov possessed medical credentials, institutional affiliation, and the beginning of an idea that would transform professional ambition into systematic murder. The Soviet military-medical complex operated in shadows even darker than the civilian system. Secret research facilities dotted Siberia's vast emptiness, places that didn't appear on maps, funded by budgets that didn't appear in records, conducting experiments that didn't appear in journals. These installations studied chemical weapons, biological warfare, radiation exposure, and the limits of human endurance under conditions that would make Nazi doctors nod in recognition. They needed researchers willing to work in isolation, ask few questions, and produce results regardless of methods. Boris Gusakov was perfect. His application to the restricted research program emphasized his expertise in pain physiology and stress response, his willingness to relocate to remote postings, his understanding of state security requirements. The interviews were conducted by men in military uniforms and civilian suits who asked carefully worded questions designed to assess not ethics but discretion. Could he work without external oversight? Did he understand the importance of state secrecy? Could he make difficult decisions in service of scientific advancement? Boris answered perfectly, his voice steady, his demeanor professional, his eyes revealing nothing of the anticipation building inside him. They saw a dedicated researcher. He saw prey standing between him and paradise. Assignment came in spring 1972. Research Station 19, located deep in the Sakha Republic where winter lasted 9 months and the nearest civilian settlement sat 300 kilometers away across frozen tundra. The facility officially studied cold weather survival and acclimatization. Unofficially, it explored how much suffering a human body could endure before total system failure. Previous researchers had produced limited results, too squeamish, too bound by residual ethical constraints, too human. Boris would have no such limitations. The journey took 4 days, train to Yakutsk, then military transport aircraft to a landing strip that was little more than packed snow. Finally, a tracked vehicle across white emptiness to a compound of brutalist concrete buildings surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. The landscape stretched infinite and hostile in every direction, swallowing sound and hope in equal measure. Perfect isolation, perfect security, perfect hunting ground. Research Station 19 housed approximately 80 personnel, military guards, support staff, and a small cadre of researchers. The commander, Colonel Andrei Volkov, ran the facility with military efficiency and carefully maintained ignorance about specifics. He provided subjects, ensured secrecy, and filed reports that emphasized patriotic service without dwelling on details. The researchers conducted their work behind locked doors in the underground laboratory levels. What happened there stayed there, buried in classified files, hidden in mass graves that the permafrost preserved like amber. Boris's assigned laboratory occupied sublevel 3, a windowless space of steel tables, drain grates, and industrial lighting that hummed constantly. Medical equipment lined the walls, monitors, pumps, instruments both standard and improvised. Restraint systems, far more robust than anything required for legitimate research, dominated the center of the room. Soundproofing panels covered the walls, installed by previous occupants who understood the necessity. Everything smelled of disinfectant layered over older, darker scents that never quite disappeared. His first subject arrived on a Tuesday in October, delivered by guards who asked no questions and made no eye contact. Male, approximately 35, unconscious from sedation, identified only by a number inked on his wrist. Political prisoner, the paperwork indicated. One of thousands who disappeared into the Gulag system for offenses real or imagined, whose absence would raise no alarms, whose death would generate no investigations. Perfect expendability. Boris prepared his workspace with the methodical care of a chef arranging knives. Scalpels in ascending sizes, clamps and retractors within easy reach, recording equipment positioned for optimal documentation. He'd waited years for this moment. Not the first dissection, but the first living dissection, the first opportunity to explore questions that cadavers couldn't answer, to push past the boundaries that constrained lesser researchers. His hands remained steady as he secured the restraints. His heartbeat stayed calm as consciousness returned to terrified eyes. His voice maintained clinical detachment as he explained nothing, because explanations implied the subject's humanity mattered. The work began. What followed over the next 18 hours combined medieval torture with modern medical precision, systematic exploration of pain thresholds, neural response patterns, and the point where suffering becomes so total that language fails. Boris documented everything with scientific rigor: vital signs, behavioral observations, physiological responses to escalating stimuli. He worked without emotion, without haste, without mercy. The laboratory's soundproofing proved necessary. The drain grates proved insufficient. By dawn, his first subject had provided extensive data and ceased providing anything else. The body went to the incinerator. The data went to his locked files. The pattern was established. Winter descended on Research Station 19 like a predator closing its jaws, transforming the Siberian landscape into an alien wasteland where temperatures plunged to -50 Celsius and darkness consumed 20 hours of every day. The facility became an island of harsh fluorescent light in an ocean of killing cold, isolated, self-contained, and utterly removed from anything resembling normal human society. For Boris Gusakov, it was paradise. His laboratory routine developed the rhythmic efficiency of an assembly line. Subjects arrived approximately twice per month, delivered by military transport from processing centers across the Gulag system. They came unconscious, identified only by numbers, accompanied by minimal paperwork that emphasized their dispensability. Political dissidents, common criminals, ethnic minorities from restive regions, people whom the Soviet state had already declared non-persons, whose disappearance served dual purposes, eliminating problems while advancing research. The machine fed Boris fresh material with bureaucratic regularity. He categorized his subjects meticulously, organizing them by age, sex, physical condition, and psychological profile. This wasn't compassion but scientific methodology, controlling variables, ensuring replicable results, maintaining data integrity. Subject 23, male, 42, dissident writer, moderate physical fitness. Subject 24, female, 28, religious activist, excellent health. Subject 25, male, 19, draft resistor, malnourished. Each became a data point, a specimen, a problem to be solved through systematic exploration of human physiological limits. The experiments evolved in complexity and cruelty. Early work focused on pain tolerance, establishing baselines for different demographics, mapping neural pathways, documenting the transition from acute suffering to psychological breakdown. Boris developed protocols that maximized consciousness duration, keeping subjects aware and responsive even as their bodies experienced catastrophic trauma. He perfected chemical combinations that prevented shock without reducing pain sensation, that stimulated nerve endings while suppressing protective unconsciousness. His notes filled volumes, written in precise scientific language that transformed screams into data points and agony into graphs. But pain tolerance research was merely foundation. Boris's true interest lay in the intersection of physical trauma and psychological dissolution, the moment when the mind breaks under suffering so comprehensive that personality itself fragments. He designed experiments that combined physiological torture with sensory manipulation and psychological warfare, creating feedback loops of escalating horror. Subjects regained consciousness in scenarios engineered to maximize disorientation and terror before the physical work even began. The laboratory became a theater of systematic mental and physical annihilation. He employed techniques borrowed from disparate sources, assembled into protocols of breathtaking cruelty. Medieval torture methods, updated with modern medical technology. Psychological operations research from military intelligence. Interrogation techniques from security services. Neurological research on trauma and dissociation. All synthesized into a methodology that Boris refined through practical application on living human beings who had no advocate, no rescue, no hope beyond eventual death. The military administration maintained willful ignorance through careful bureaucratic distance. Colonel Volkov received regular reports emphasizing progress in cold weather survival research and stress tolerance studies without dwelling on methodology. Budget requests for medical supplies and subject procurement flowed through channels designed to obscure specifics. The guards who delivered subjects understood that questions shorten careers and lifespans. Everyone participated in collective denial, protected by classification levels and the knowledge that speaking up meant joining the experimental population. Boris worked in shifts, sometimes 30 hours straight, when a particularly resilient subject provided extended research opportunities. He consumed amphetamines to maintain focus, drank vodka to sleep, ate meals without tasting them. His world contracted to the laboratory and his quarters, a Spartan room containing a bed, desk, and filing cabinets filled with meticulously organized notes. He had no friends, no relationships, no life beyond the work. Other researchers at the facility maintained minimal social contact, speaking in euphemisms about their projects, drinking together in the mess hall where conversations never touched on specifics. Boris avoided even these perfunctory interactions, preferring solitude and the company of his documentation. His reputation within the classified research community grew despite, or because of, the secrecy surrounding his work. Reports filtered through military medical channels describing unprecedented findings in pain physiology, stress response, and human resilience limits. Senior researchers in Moscow noted the promising young doctor producing exceptional results under difficult conditions. Requests came for him to present findings at classified conferences, to consult on other projects, to expand his research protocols. Boris declined, unwilling to leave his laboratory paradise, determined to push deeper into territories no researcher had explored. By early 1974, he'd processed 47 subjects, accumulating data that represented humanity's most comprehensive and most horrifying understanding of suffering. His filing system grew to occupy an entire wall, color-coded by experiment type, cross-referenced by variables, indexed with the precision of a man building a monument to systematic cruelty. He began to see patterns, to develop theories about pain as a fundamental human experience, to conceptualize suffering as a physiological process that could be engineered and controlled with the same precision as chemical reactions. Subject 48 arrived in March, breaking the pattern. Female, 23, not a political prisoner but a nurse from Novosibirsk arrested for stealing medical supplies. Her file was thinner than usual, her classification less definitive, her presence at the facility apparently an administrative error. She regained consciousness in the laboratory to find Boris preparing instruments and did something none of his previous subjects had done. She spoke to him as a fellow medical professional. "You're a doctor," she said, voice steady despite obvious terror. "You took an oath." Boris paused, scalpel in hand, genuinely curious about this appeal to ethics he'd abandoned years ago. "I'm a researcher," he corrected. "The oath applies to patients. You're a subject. I'm a human being. Biologically, yes. Legally and practically, you ceased being human when the state declared you criminal. I didn't create that distinction. I merely work within it." She tried reason, then pleading, then offers, information, cooperation, silence. Boris listened with detached interest, studying the psychological progression from hope to desperation to acceptance. Then he proceeded with the planned protocol, documenting her responses with the same clinical precision he applied to all subjects. By the end, she'd provided excellent data on the differential pain responses between male and female subjects. The conversation was never mentioned again. Spring brought administrative changes. Colonel Volkov retired, replaced by Colonel Dmitry Orlov, a younger officer with ambitions and fewer qualms about knowing details. Orlov toured the facility thoroughly, including the restricted laboratory levels where previous commanders had feared to tread. He observed Boris's work firsthand, watched partial procedures, reviewed documentation. Instead of recoiling, he saw opportunity. "Your research has military applications beyond cold weather survival," Orlov noted during a private meeting. "Interrogation resistance, prisoner management, psychological warfare. The Defense Ministry would be very interested in practical applications." Boris felt something close to excitement, not at the prospect of expansion but at the implicit permission to intensify his work. Practical applications require additional subjects and expanded facilities. That can be arranged. The state has endless supply of suitable candidates, and your results justify resource allocation. I'll authorize facility expansion and increased subject procurement. The arrangement marked a turning point from isolated research to systematic program. Boris's subject allocation doubled, then tripled. Additional laboratory spaces were constructed on Sublevel 4, designed to his specifications with improved drainage, enhanced soundproofing, and equipment that pushed beyond medical science into engineering torture with industrial efficiency. Support staff increased, technicians, guards, cleaning crews who worked in silence and kept their eyes down. The operation scaled up from boutique sadism to mass production. New subjects arrived in batches now, sometimes 10 or 15 in a week, warehoused in holding cells until Boris could process them. He developed triage systems, categorizing incoming prisoners by research priority, organizing them into experimental groups, scheduling procedures with the efficiency of a factory manager. The work became routine in its horror, systematic in its cruelty, bureaucratic in its banality. He trained assistants, younger researchers assigned to the program who showed aptitude for the work and appropriate moral flexibility. Boris taught them his protocols, refined their techniques, critiqued their documentation. Some washed out quickly, unable to maintain necessary detachment. Others adapted, discovering capacities for cruelty they hadn't known they possessed. The most successful learned to view subjects as biological systems rather than people, to hear screams as data rather than suffering. Boris created disciples in his own image. By late 1974, Research Station 19 had processed more than 200 subjects through Boris's expanded operation. Mass graves in the permafrost beyond the facility perimeter held bodies that would remain frozen for millennia, preserved evidence of systematic atrocity. The incinerator ran constantly, consuming remains and paperwork with equal efficiency. The drain systems carried away biological waste into septic systems that the cold kept from ever fully processing, creating underground reservoirs of crystallized horror. Boris's reputation within the classified system reached near-mythical status. The researcher who produced impossible results, who pushed boundaries that others feared to approach, who advanced the science of suffering beyond anything previously documented. Requests came from other facilities for his protocols, his consultation, his training expertise. The Soviet military medical complex recognized him as a valuable asset, a man whose work contributed to state security and scientific advancement. They protected him, resourced him, and turned blind eyes to methodology because results mattered more than methods. The machine had found its perfect operator, and the operator had found his perfect machine. Boris Gusakov had transformed from individual killer into institutional asset, his personal sadism legitimized by state sponsorship and scientific veneer. He'd built a hell that ran on paperwork and produced data, where murder masqueraded as research and atrocity hid behind classification stamps. And he was just getting started. The expansion of Research Station 19's operations paralleled the growth of Boris's ambitions. What began as individual experiments evolved into comprehensive research programs, each designed to explore different aspects of human suffering with systematic thoroughness. By 1975, his laboratory complex resembled a dark university where the curriculum consisted of torture and the degree was death. Sublevels 3 and 4 had become a maze of specialized chambers, each dedicated to particular methodologies, each containing equipment that would make medieval executioners weep with envy. Chamber 1 focused on sensory deprivation and psychological dissolution. Subjects were suspended in lightless, soundproofed isolation tanks filled with temperature-neutral saline solution, kept alive through feeding tubes and medical monitoring, while their minds slowly fractured under the weight of absolute nothingness. Boris documented the timeline of psychological breakdown with clinical precision. Hallucinations typically began around 72 hours, personality fragmentation around 5 days, complete dissociation within 2 weeks. Some subjects emerged as hollow shells, their consciousness shattered beyond recovery. Others never emerged at all, their hearts simply stopping as if death offered the only escape from nothing. Chamber 2 explored chemical agents, compounds that amplified pain sensation, that prevented sleep for weeks, that induced terror so profound that subjects would injure themselves attempting to escape their own minds. Boris developed cocktails mixing experimental drugs from military laboratories with traditional substances, creating pharmacological nightmares tailored to individual physiology. He maintained precise logs of dosages, reactions, and outcomes, building a pharmacopoeia of suffering that represented humanity's most advanced understanding of chemically induced agony. Chamber 3 utilized physical methodology, refined versions of classical torture enhanced with modern medical knowledge. Boris had studied history's torturers and found them primitive, limited by lack of anatomical understanding and inability to prevent death. He corrected their mistakes, developing techniques that maximize damage while minimizing mortality risk, that could be sustained for days rather than hours, that exploited nerve clusters and pain pathways with surgical precision. The chamber's walls bore soundproofing panels that had absorbed screams from dozens of subjects, creating layers of acoustic horror that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. Chamber 4 combined elements from the others into integrated protocols. Simultaneous sensory, chemical, and physical assault that overwhelmed every defensive mechanism the human mind and body possessed. Subjects in Chamber 4 experienced suffering so comprehensive that language failed to describe it, that observers struggled to witness even through observation windows, that produced data so extreme that Boris's reports required special classification beyond the already classified project. These were experiments in absolute human destruction, designed to determine not whether breaking points existed but how thoroughly a person could be shattered. The subject population diversified as Boris's resource allocation increased. Political prisoners still formed the majority, but he also received condemned criminals, prisoners of war from border conflicts the Soviet public never knew occurred, and occasionally individuals whose presence remained unexplained even in classified documentation. Rumors circulated among the research staff about special deliveries, foreign intelligence operatives, defectors being eliminated, individuals who displeased the wrong people in Moscow's labyrinthine power structure. These subjects arrived with additional security protocols and disappeared more completely than standard prisoners, their existence erased from every record except Boris's meticulously maintained experimental logs. He developed a system for extracting maximum research value from each subject. Initial assessment determined baseline physiology and psychology. Preliminary protocols tested general pain tolerance and stress response. Then customized experimental sequences exploited individual characteristics, previous trauma, phobias, physical weaknesses, psychological vulnerabilities. Boris viewed each subject as a unique problem requiring tailored solution, approaching them with the focus a master craftsman brings to challenging material. Some subjects lasted hours, others lasted weeks. The longest surviving, a former soldier with extraordinary physiological resilience, provided research opportunities for 37 days before his body finally succumbed. The documentation Boris produced reached encyclopedic proportions. His filing system expanded to fill multiple rooms, organized with librarian precision into categories, subcategories, and cross-references. Medical charts tracked vital signs and physiological responses. Psychological assessments documented mental deterioration. Photographs provided visual evidence, clinical images that captured damage with surgical clarity. Video recordings preserved complete procedures, creating archives of horror that served as training materials for new researchers. Everything was preserved, indexed, and analyzed, transforming individual atrocities into data sets and death screams into statistical samples. Colonel Orlov's administration actively promoted Boris's work throughout the military medical establishment. Reports highlighting breakthrough findings circulated among senior officials in Moscow, carefully worded to emphasize scientific achievement while obscuring methodology. The Defense Ministry took particular interest in interrogation applications. Techniques that could break prisoners without leaving marks, that could extract information through psychological manipulation enhanced by pharmaceutical intervention, that represented evolution beyond crude physical coercion. Boris was invited to present findings at classified conferences where he stood before audiences of generals and intelligence officials, describing his work in antiseptic language that concealed oceans of blood behind walls of technical terminology. Recognition brought resources. Budget allocations increased substantially, funding equipment acquisitions that pushed technology boundaries. Boris requisitioned specialized medical devices, custom-fabricated restraint systems, monitoring equipment sensitive enough to track biological responses at cellular level. He imported restricted pharmaceuticals from military research laboratories, acquired surgical instruments designed for experimental procedures, obtained chemical compounds that existed nowhere outside weapons development programs. His laboratory became the most advanced facility in the Soviet system for studying human suffering, a distinction simultaneously impressive and horrifying. The research staff under Boris's direction grew to 12 full-time researchers plus support personnel. He selected them carefully, looking for specific qualities, exceptional technical skills, comfortable moral flexibility, and capacity to maintain secrecy under absolute classification requirements. Most were young doctors and scientists with limited options, assigned to remote postings as punishment or because their careers had stalled in the civilian system. Some arrived idealistic, viewing the posting as patriotic service. Boris broke them of idealism quickly, demonstrating that success required abandoning conventional ethics in favor of results-focused pragmatism. Those who couldn't adapt were transferred out. Those who stayed became extensions of his methodology, disciples spreading his gospel of systematic cruelty. Training new researchers revealed Boris's pedagogical approach: cold, thorough, utterly devoid of sentiment. He taught anatomy through vivisection, explaining neural pathways while exposing them in conscious subjects. He demonstrated pain induction techniques with clinical detachment, narrating procedures while subjects screamed through gags. He critiqued trainee performances with the same dispassionate precision a music teacher might apply to student recitals, noting areas for improvement without acknowledging the human cost of imperfect technique. The best students learned to match his emotional detachment, to view subjects as biological systems rather than people, to hear agony as feedback rather than suffering. They became effective researchers and accomplished monsters. By 1976, Research Station 19 had processed more than 400 subjects through Boris's programs. The body count mounted in unmarked graves that dotted the tundra around the facility, each containing multiple remains, each location marked only in classified maps maintained by facility security. The permafrost preserved everything: frozen corpses that would remain intact for centuries, evidence of systematic murder protected by isolation and state secrecy. Future archaeologists might one day uncover this graveyard and struggle to comprehend the scale of organized killing that occurred in the name of research. Boris himself evolved during these years. his personality constricting around his work until nothing else remained. He ceased maintaining even perfunctory social contacts, eating meals alone in his quarters, avoiding facility common areas, interacting with others only when professionally necessary. His appearance deteriorated. Weight loss from irregular eating, pallor from spending weeks underground without sunlight, hands developing slight tremors from amphetamine overuse. Colleagues noted his increasing eeriness, the way his pale eyes seemed to look through rather than at people, the complete absence of normal human warmth in his rare smiles. He had become his work, transformed from person into function, his humanity eroding like coastline under relentless waves. The psychological cost of his activities never manifested as guilt or conscience. Boris experienced no nightmares, no flashbacks, no moral qualms about the suffering he engineered with such systematic precision. Instead, he felt satisfaction bordering on joy, pride in his methodology, pleasure in his expertise, fulfillment in pushing boundaries others feared to approach. He was accomplishing something unprecedented, advancing human knowledge into territories previous researchers could only imagine. That this advancement was built on mountains of bodies and oceans of agony never troubled him. He'd long ago internalized the logic that justified anything in service of scientific progress and state security. Senior officials in Moscow began discussing Boris for promotion and expanded responsibilities. His results were simply too valuable to restrict to single facility operations. Plans developed to replicate his methodology at other research stations, to create a network of black sites applying his protocols throughout the Gulag system, to institutionalize his approach as standard practice. Boris would become director of this empire of agony, transforming from individual practitioner to architect of systematic suffering on unprecedented scale. Then politics intervened. The death of Defense Minister Andrei Grechko in April 1976 triggered power struggles within the Soviet military establishment. New leadership brought new priorities and new sensitivities about international perception. Reports about Soviet human rights abuses were generating negative attention from Western governments and media. The classified research programs, previously protected by powerful sponsors, suddenly became potential embarrassments. Nervous bureaucrats began reviewing black budget expenditures, questioning projects that might prove awkward if exposed. Research Station 19 attracted unwanted scrutiny. A review committee arrived in September 1976, consisting of military officers and civilian administrators tasked with assessing program necessity and exposure risk. They toured the facility, interviewed personnel, reviewed documentation under strict security protocols. Boris presented his work with characteristic detachment, showing the committee selected data while keeping methodology vague. But the committee members weren't researchers, they were bureaucrats concerned with political risk, and what they saw horrified them not from moral perspective but from public relations standpoint. The committee's classified report acknowledged the research's scientific value while highlighting catastrophic exposure risks. If Western intelligence learned specifics about activities at Research Station 19, the propaganda damage would be substantial. International agreements on human rights that the Soviet Union had signed, even without intending compliance, created legal vulnerabilities. The program represented potential scandal that could embarrass the state at highest levels. Recommendation: wind down operations, transfer valuable research to more defensible programs, close the facility, destroy evidence, eliminate exposure risks. Boris received notice in November. Research Station 19 would cease operations by year-end. Remaining subjects would be processed through final protocols and disposed of. Documentation would be consolidated and transferred to central archives in Moscow. Facility would be decommissioned and repurposed. Research staff would receive new assignments to less controversial programs. The empire was ending not because anyone thought the work was wrong, but because it had become politically inconvenient. He accepted the decision with outward compliance while internally calculating alternatives. For years of work, hundreds of subjects, revolutionary findings in pain physiology and psychological warfare, all to be boxed up and forgotten because nervous administrators feared bad publicity. The injustice of it, from Boris's perspective, was profound. He'd been given permission to explore forbidden knowledge, had produced unprecedented results, and now was being shut down not for failure but for success. Political considerations were destroying legitimate scientific achievement. The final weeks at Research Station 19 were a frenzy of activity. Boris processed remaining subjects through accelerated protocols, determined to extract maximum research value before the shutdown. He personally supervised documentation consolidation, ensuring his records were complete and properly organized for archival storage. He methodically destroyed evidence that might prove embarrassing, disposing of equipment that bore too many bloodstains, burning photographs too graphic even for classified archives, sanitizing laboratory spaces that had absorbed too much horror. And he made careful copies of key documentation, secreting them away in personal luggage, unwilling to trust that the bureaucratic system would preserve his life's work. Research Station 19 officially closed on December 23, 1976. The last subjects died in the incinerator alongside furniture and contaminated supplies. The laboratory levels were stripped and sealed. Most personnel transferred to new assignments scattered across the Soviet military medical system. Boris received posting to a civilian research hospital in Vladivostok, administrative punishment disguised as reassignment, a message that his particular expertise was no longer required. He departed Research Station 19 on a gray morning, the facility already feeling abandoned despite skeleton crew remaining for decommissioning. The landscape stretched unchanged in every direction. The same hostile emptiness he'd first seen 4 years earlier, the permafrost concealing evidence of systematic atrocity that would remain frozen until climate change or geological time exposed it. Boris looked back once at the concrete buildings that had housed his paradise, then turned away without sentiment. The facility was just infrastructure. The work was what mattered, and the work, he was determined, would continue. Vladivostok emerged from winter fog like a decrepit stage set, its buildings exhaling steam into frozen air, its streets coated in industrial grime mixed with ice. The city sprawled across hills overlooking the Sea of Japan, a military port where Pacific Fleet warships rusted alongside fishing trawlers, and the population endured harsh climate and chronic shortages with characteristic Soviet stoicism. For Boris Gusakov, arriving in early 1977, the city represented exile, a fall from the heights of unrestricted research to the mundane drudgery of civilian medicine. His assignment at Municipal Hospital No. 3 was deliberately demeaning. The hospital occupied a crumbling building constructed in the Stalin era, its plumbing unreliable, its heating inadequate, its equipment outdated by decades. Boris was assigned to the emergency department, treating drunken brawls and industrial accidents, his expertise in pain physiology wasted on morphine administration and wound suturing. The message was clear. His particular skills were no longer valued, his research concluded, his career as monster in state service terminated. He endured 6 months of this purgatory, maintaining professional performance while internally seething at the waste of his capabilities. But Boris was patient and calculating. He'd spent 4 years developing methodology and documentation that represented unprecedented understanding of human suffering. That knowledge wouldn't simply disappear because administrators feared exposure. It had value to the right people under the right circumstances through the right channels. The Soviet system was riddled with informal networks. Intelligence services competing for resources and influence, military branches protecting turf, research institutions pursuing classified agendas. Boris began making careful contacts, reaching out to former colleagues, connecting with researchers in adjacent fields, identifying people who might appreciate what he'd accomplished at Research Station 19. He was circumspect, never committing details to writing or traceable communications, but gradually building awareness that valuable expertise was sitting idle in a Vladivostok emergency room. Opportunity arrived through an unexpected channel. In August 1977, Boris received visitor at his apartment. A civilian of indeterminate age wearing expensive suit that marked him as someone important despite unremarkable features. No identification was offered. No pleasantries were exchanged. The conversation went directly to business. Your work at Research Station 19 has been reviewed by people interested in practical applications, the visitor stated. The program's closure was premature. Certain organizations believe your research should continue, perhaps in different context. Boris felt something close to hope. What kind of context? Less visible, more focused. Activities that advance state security without creating documentation trails or budget line items. You would work alone with selected subjects provided through irregular channels. Results would be reported verbally to designated handlers. No written records, no institutional affiliation, complete deniability. It was both promotion and demotion, elevated importance combined with absolute disposability. If exposure occurred, Boris would face consequences alone, abandoned by sponsors who would deny any knowledge of his activities. But the alternative was continuing to waste in civilian medicine, his expertise unutilized, his passion unfulfilled. The choice was obvious. "I accept," Boris said. The arrangement was established through a series of careful meetings in anonymous locations. Boris would maintain his hospital position as cover, living in his modest apartment, avoiding attention. Periodically, subjects would be delivered to a facility, an abandoned factory building on Vladivostok's industrial outskirts, retrofitted with basic laboratory equipment and soundproofing. He would conduct research according to his own protocols, document findings verbally through secure communications, and dispose of evidence completely. Payment would come through circuitous channels, sufficient to supplement his hospital salary and fund equipment purchases. The subjects came from sources even more marginal than the Gulag system. Foreign sailors who disappeared during port visits and were never missed. Chinese border crossers intercepted by military patrols. Homeless individuals whom society had already forgotten. Occasionally, names that suggested more targeted acquisition, journalists who'd investigated wrong topics, activists who'd opposed wrong policies, individuals who'd simply offended someone with the power to make them disappear. All arrived unconscious, all left as ash. None were ever reported missing. Boris worked in the shadow system for 3 years, conducting experiments that built on his Research Station 19 methodology while adapting to resource limitations. The abandoned factory lacked the sophisticated equipment of his previous facility, forcing improvisation and creativity. But constraints bred innovation. He developed protocols that required minimal technology, that maximized research value from each subject, that produced results satisfying his handlers while feeding his pathological needs. The work evolved beyond pure research toward applied interrogation support. His handlers occasionally requested specific information: how to break prisoners quickly, how to extract intelligence without leaving marks, how to induce cooperation through precisely calibrated suffering. Boris provided consultations, sometimes even participating directly when particularly resistant subjects required his expertise. He became a ghost in the system, known to the few who needed to know, invisible to everyone else, protected by deniability and classification. But the Soviet system itself was beginning its terminal decline. The Afghanistan war was draining resources and morale. Economic stagnation was eroding state authority. Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985 brought glasnost and perestroika, policies of openness and restructuring that threatened to expose secrets long buried behind classification stamps and institutional walls. The informal networks protecting Boris and his work began to fray as bureaucrats positioned for the coming upheaval. In 1986, a confluence of factors triggered collapse. A subject Boris was working with, a suspected Chinese intelligence operative, died unexpectedly from cardiac arrest before yielding useful information. His handlers were displeased. Simultaneously, KGB reorganization displaced several of Boris's primary sponsors, replacing them with officers less invested in continuing irregular programs. Budget pressures forced choices between visible priorities and shadow operations. The cost-benefit analysis turned against Boris. The termination came abruptly. No polite reassignment this time, just a stark message through his handler. Operations were concluded, the factory facility would be sanitized. His services were no longer required. The implication was clear: continue living quietly and be forgotten, or make noise and be silenced permanently. Boris understood the terms. He shut down his private research, destroyed remaining equipment and documentation, and retreated into his hospital position, bitter but alive. For 3 years he endured genuine exile, watching the Soviet Union disintegrate around him while his skills atrophied. The Berlin Wall fell, the Eastern Bloc collapsed, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into component republics. In the chaos of transition, many things were lost. Records burned, archives scattered, individuals who'd served the old system suddenly anxious to distance themselves from their pasts. Boris destroyed what remained of his documentation, fearing that exposure in the new Russia might mean prosecution rather than protection. But he'd kept one insurance policy, a complete copy of his Research Station 19 records, hidden carefully, preserved against the day they might have value. In 1992, struggling financially as hyperinflation destroyed his savings and hospital salaries became worthless, Boris began shopping his archives. He made discreet contacts with foreign intelligence services, with private military contractors, with anyone who might pay for unprecedented documentation of torture methodologies and human experimentation results. The French intelligence service bit first, paying substantial sum for partial documentation. Then the Americans, interested in interrogation research. A private military company operating in African conflicts purchased protocols for field interrogation. An Asian intelligence service acquired chemical agent documentation. Boris monetized his horror piecemeal, selling humanity's suffering to the highest bidders, justifying it as merely capitalizing on research he'd already conducted. No new victims were created, he told himself. He was simply allowing his past work to serve new purposes. The transactions generated income but also exposure. Intelligence services talked to each other, sometimes sharing information, sometimes competing. Boris's name began circulating in classified channels as source for disturbing but valuable research on pain, interrogation, and human limits. Human rights organizations, receiving tips from intelligence community sources, began investigating. Journalists following rumors of Soviet-era human experimentation discovered threads connecting to a Dr. Boris Gusakov in Vladivostok. In 1998, a Russian investigative journalist named Sergei Volkov published an article in a small opposition newspaper connecting Boris to Research Station 19 and detailing allegations of systematic human experimentation. The story gained limited traction in Russia's chaotic media environment, but international human rights organizations seized on it, demanding investigation. Boris found himself subject to police inquiries, though lack of surviving official documentation made prosecution difficult. The investigation dragged through Russia's dysfunctional legal system. Witnesses were difficult to locate. Many former Research Station 19 personnel had died, disappeared, or refused cooperation. Physical evidence was non-existent. The facility had been decommissioned and repurposed decades ago. The graves were in remote locations in now-independent Sakha Republic. The documentation had been destroyed or was protected by intelligence classification. Boris denied everything, claiming the allegations were fabrications by anti-Russian propagandists exploiting Cold War mythology. Then, in 2001, a breakthrough. A former guard from Research Station 19, dying from cancer and seeking absolution, provided detailed testimony to investigators. He described the laboratory levels, the screams that penetrated soundproofing, the truckloads of bodies taken to burial sites, the absolute prohibition on discussing what occurred underground. His testimony provided corroboration, transforming allegations into actionable case. Boris was arrested in March 2002, charged with crimes against humanity, a designation Russia had recently adopted in its criminal code to align with international law. The trial became international news, one of the first prosecutions of Soviet-era human rights abuses in post-communist Russia. Prosecutors presented the guard's testimony, fragments of declassified documentation, expert testimony on the impossibility of legitimate research producing the alleged results. Boris's defense argued lack of physical evidence, claimed he'd conducted authorized medical research within legal framework of time, suggested prosecution was politically motivated. The trial revealed horrors but also demonstrated the difficulty of prosecuting state-sponsored atrocities decades after the fact. Key documentation remained classified or destroyed. Most potential witnesses were dead or had fled the country. The facility itself had been demolished. Prosecutors struggled to prove specifics beyond reasonable doubt despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Boris maintained that his research had been legitimate cold-weather survival studies authorized by appropriate Soviet authorities. After 8 months of testimony, the court convicted Boris on 23 counts of crimes against humanity, far fewer than the hundreds of victims prosecutors believed he'd killed, but sufficient for mandatory life sentence. The verdict acknowledged that he'd systematically tortured and murdered prisoners in the guise of medical research, that he'd operated with institutional support but exceeded any legitimate research parameters, that his actions constituted some of the most severe human rights violations committed in the Soviet system. Sentencing was almost anticlimactic. Boris, now 74 years old, physically deteriorated but mentally sharp, showed no remorse. When asked if he wished to address the court, he declined. No apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgement of victims' humanity. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his pale blue eyes revealing nothing, his mind already detached from the proceedings. He was sent to prison colony number 56 in Krasnoyarsk Krai, a harsh facility housing Russia's most serious criminals. Fellow inmates, learning his crimes, ostracized him completely. Guards provided minimal protection, viewing him as monster unworthy of basic dignity. Boris endured isolation and occasional violence, his body failing while his mind remained trapped in memories of his laboratory years. The only period he considered meaningful, the only time he felt truly alive. In 2006, Boris developed advanced lung cancer, likely from decades of chemical exposure in his research. He refused treatment, telling prison medical staff that aggressive intervention was pointless at his age. As the disease progressed, his physical condition deteriorated rapidly. By September, he required constant medical supervision. He died on October 8, 2006, age 78, alone in the prison medical unit. His last words, recorded by a guard, were reportedly, "The research was valid. No family claimed his body." He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, one more forgotten corpse in frozen ground. But his legacy survived him. The documentation he'd sold to intelligence services and military contractors circulated in classified channels. His methodology studied and sometimes applied by organizations with flexible ethics and practical needs. Human rights organizations used his trial to highlight the need for accountability for Soviet-era crimes, though hundreds of similar researchers were never prosecuted. Scholars studied his case as an example of how ordinary professionals can become willing participants in systematic atrocity when provided institutional protection and ideological justification. The graves around former Research Station 19 remain unmarked and largely undiscovered, containing bodies that the permafrost preserves indefinitely. Evidence of systematic murder that may someday be excavated, identified, and properly mourned. The facility itself was demolished, the site now hosting a weather research station whose personnel have no idea what occurred beneath the ground they walk on. Boris Gusakov's story is not unique. He was one of many researchers who exploited totalitarian systems to pursue sadistic fascinations under scientific guise. But his particular combination of technical skill, moral vacancy, and institutional support made him among the most prolific and systematic practitioners of state-sponsored torture in the Soviet system. He turned human beings into specimens, suffering into data, and murder into research. A transformation that required not just individual pathology but active support from a system that valued results more than humanity. His death closed one chapter but couldn't erase what he'd done or fully reveal how many victims suffered in his laboratories. The estimates range from 400 to over 700 individuals tortured to death across his career, though the true number may never be known. Each represented a person with history, relationships, hopes, all reduced to data points in files that chronicled their destruction with clinical precision. The monster is dead. The graves remain. The documentation persists. And the question lingers: how many others like Boris Gusakov conducted similar research in facilities still unknown, their crimes still buried, their victims still unmourned? The Soviet system that enabled him operated hundreds of classified research facilities. Boris was exceptional only in being exposed. That, perhaps, is the most chilling legacy. Not that such monsters existed, but that they were systematically created, officially sanctioned, and institutionally protected. Boris Gusakov was a product, not an aberration. The system made him, used him, and would have protected him forever if politics hadn't intervened. He was state-sponsored evil with medical credentials, proof that civilization's veneer is thin and easily pierced when authority gives permission and science provides justification. The screams have finally stopped in Boris's laboratories, but they echo still in the frozen ground of Siberia, in the classified archives that preserve his methodology, in the uncomfortable truth that humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty remains limitless when properly organized and officially authorized. Some monsters wear hockey masks and carry chainsaws. Others wear white coats and carry scalpels. Boris Gusakov proved that the latter are far more dangerous, because they don't hunt in shadows. They hunt in institutions, protected by classification stamps and moral detachment, turning atrocity into procedure and murder into research. The permafrost keeps its secrets. The graves remain unmarked, and somewhere, perhaps, another researcher sits in another classified facility, convinced that the pursuit of knowledge justifies any methodology, that science transcends ethics, that subjects aren't really people when the state says they're not. Boris is dead, but the system that created him just changes its name and continues operating, because humanity never learns the lessons that history screams from frozen ground. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Blue-Beard Killer, America's most charming serial husband. Some men collect stamps. Others collect coins. Alfred Leonard Klein collected widows and their death certificates. Between 1930 and 1945, at least 9 women said, "I do" to a silver-tongued devil, unaware they were signing their own death warrants. The champagne was still cold when the first wife started convulsing. By morning, she was dead, and Alfred Klein was already shopping for a new suit, black, for the funeral, where he'd meet his next victim. This is the story of a predator who turned matrimony into murder, seduction into systematic slaughter, and the American dream into a 15-year nightmare that law enforcement couldn't stop. Tonight, we're tracking a killer who weaponized love itself, a man so dangerous that every kiss was potentially fatal, every vow a death sentence. His hunting ground? The Lonely Hearts columns of newspapers across America. His weapon? A vial of poison hidden in plain sight. His tally? Bodies buried in 4 different states, each one insured, each one cremated before questions could be asked. Welcome to the twisted saga of Alfred Leonard Klein, the man who turned "till death do us part" into a business model. The orphanage in Buffalo, New York, smelled of boiled cabbage and broken dreams when Alfred Leonard Klein first opened his eyes to the world in 1888. No mother's lullaby welcomed him. No father's arms cradled his infant body. Instead, cold institutional walls and the mechanical care of overwhelmed nurses shaped his earliest memories. The other children learned quickly that young Alfred was different. Not in the way that inspired sympathy, but in the way that triggered primitive warning signals deep in the human brain. By age 7, Alfred had already mastered the art of manipulation with surgical precision. While other orphans fought openly for scraps of attention, Alfred smiled, charmed, and maneuvered. He discovered early that tears could be manufactured, that sincerity could be performed, and that adults, particularly women, possessed a fatal weakness for a well-mannered boy with sorrowful eyes. The orphanage headmistress, Mrs. Pemberton, often remarked how little Alfred was such a gentleman, so unlike the other ruffians. She never noticed when food disappeared from the kitchen, never suspected that the angelic child volunteering to help her was already practicing the con artist's fundamental skill, making people see exactly what they wanted to see while reality unfolded in shadows. His adolescence arrived like a gathering storm. While his body stretched toward manhood, his mind sharpened into something altogether more sinister. At 14, he secured a position at a downtown haberdashery through sheer charisma, convincing the owner that an orphan boy would work twice as hard for half the wages. The owner was right about the work ethic, but catastrophically wrong about everything else. Within 6 months, Alfred had learned to forge signatures, manipulate account books, and most importantly, had discovered the intoxicating power of a well-tailored suit. Clothing became his armor, his camouflage, his weapon. Alfred understood instinctively what many criminals never grasp. Appearance isn't merely about looking good. It's about constructing an identity so convincing that suspicion evaporates on contact. He studied wealthy men on the streets of Buffalo with the intensity of a wolf observing its prey, noting how they walked, talked, gestured. He memorized the precise angle at which a gentleman tipped his hat, the exact modulation of voice that conveyed breeding and education. By 16, this orphan boy could pass for old money in any room in America. But Buffalo was too small, its social circles too tight, its opportunities too limited. Alfred craved bigger stages, wealthier marks, and most of all, freedom from the constant surveillance of people who remembered him as that pathetic orphan child. At 17, he vanished from Buffalo like smoke, leaving behind unpaid debts, broken promises, and a haberdashery owner who finally discovered that his account books had been systematically falsified for years. The American West beckoned with promises of reinvention. This was the era of motion pictures and manifest destiny, when a man could shed his past like a snake shedding skin and emerge reborn in California sunshine. Alfred drifted from San Francisco to Los Angeles, from Seattle to Portland, never staying long enough to accumulate enemies, always moving before the con could unravel. He worked as a salesman, a clerk, a stock promoter, any occupation that rewarded silver-tongued persuasion over actual skill. But these were merely rehearsals, practice runs for the grand performance that would define his murderous career. During these wandering years, Alfred discovered 2 crucial truths that would shape his methodology. First, America was full of lonely women, widows whose husbands had died in the Great War, spinsters whose matrimonial prospects had evaporated in the carnage of European trenches, divorcees seeking second chances at happiness. Second, these women often possessed something even more valuable than beauty or youth. They had money. The insurance industry was booming in the 1920s, and Alfred studied its mechanisms with scholarly dedication. He learned about beneficiary clauses, about payout schedules, about how quickly claims could be processed when death appeared natural. He researched poisons with the thoroughness of a chemistry student, focusing on substances that mimicked common ailments, that left minimal traces, that killed efficiently but not suspiciously fast. Arsenic was too traceable, too associated with murder in the public imagination. Strychnine caused convulsions that looked too violent, too dramatic. But there were other options, subtler choices that could transform a healthy woman into a sick woman, and a sick woman into a dead woman without raising alarms. His first marriage happened in 1930, though calling it a marriage almost dignifies what was essentially a calculated murder plot with a ceremony attached. The woman's name was Delora Krebs, a widow of 43 who had placed a Lonely Hearts advertisement in the San Francisco Chronicle. Her late husband had left her comfortable. A modest house, some savings bonds, and a life insurance policy she'd maintained, irrationally perhaps, in hope of remarrying. Alfred responded to her advertisement with a letter so beautifully composed, so perfectly calibrated to strike every note of romantic longing, that Delora later told friends she'd read it 17 times the first night she received it. Their courtship was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Alfred appeared at her door dressed impeccably, bearing flowers but not too many flowers, enough to show thoughtfulness, not so many as to suggest desperation. He listened to her stories of loss with perfect attentiveness, his eyes never wandering, his expressions calibrated to show empathy without pity. He revealed his own fictional past in carefully measured doses. The tragic death of his own parents, the the years of struggling alone, the dream of finding a true partner to build a life with. Every word was a lie, but every lie was designed to make Delora feel that she'd finally, miraculously, found her soulmate. They married within 3 months. Delora updated her insurance policy, naming her beloved new husband as sole beneficiary. She never noticed how quickly he'd suggested this practical arrangement, never questioned why a man who claimed to be comfortably situated financially would need her modest policy as security. Love, that most treacherous of human emotions, had blinded her completely. The poison began within weeks of the wedding. Nothing dramatic at first, just occasional stomach troubles, headaches that came and went, a general sense of malaise that Delora attributed to the excitement of her new marriage. Alfred played the concerned husband flawlessly, suggesting doctors, preparing special meals, administering tonics that he claimed would restore her strength. These tonics, of course, contained the very agents that were destroying her from within, slowly, methodically, irreversibly. For months after their wedding, Delora Krebs Klein died in her bed, her new husband holding her hand, tears streaming down his face. The doctor who signed the death certificate listed gastroenteritis as the cause, inflammation of the stomach and intestines, common enough, especially in women of a certain age. No autopsy was performed. No questions were asked. Alfred collected $12,000 in insurance money, sold Delora's house, and disappeared from San Francisco within 3 weeks of her funeral. The pattern was established. The method was proven. The monster was fully awake. Over the next year, Alfred refined his technique with the dedication of a craftsman perfecting his art. He learned to space his marriages geographically, never two in the same city, never two in rapid succession where authorities might notice a pattern. He discovered that cremation eliminated most forensic evidence, and began persuading his brides that cremation was more modern, more dignified than traditional burial. He researched which states had lax oversight of insurance claims, which jurisdictions had overworked coroners who rarely performed autopsies on seemingly natural deaths. By 1932, 3 more women had married Alfred Leonard Klein. By 1932, 3 more women were dead. Their names were Margaret Collins, Ruth Armstrong, and Dorothy Shaw. Each had been lonely. Each had been trusting. Each had been financially comfortable. Each had made Alfred their sole beneficiary. And each had died after a mysterious illness that seemed to baffle their doctors but never quite warranted deeper investigation. The amounts he collected grew with each successful murder. $8,000 from Margaret, $15,000 from Ruth, $22,000 from Dorothy, who'd been particularly well insured. In Depression-era America, these were staggering sums, equivalent to hundreds of thousands in modern currency. Alfred lived well between murders, fine hotels, expensive restaurants, custom-tailored suits. But he always returned to the hunt, driven by something darker than simple greed. The truth was more disturbing than financial motivation could explain. Alfred had discovered that he enjoyed it. The courtship was intoxicating. The performance, the deception, the godlike power of knowing that the woman across the dinner table, blushing at his compliments, had no idea she was already dead, that her fate had been sealed the moment she'd responded to his letter. The murder itself provided a different thrill. Watching the poison work, observing the gradual deterioration, playing the concerned husband while secretly monitoring the progression toward death. And the aftermath. The insurance payout, the clean getaway, brought a satisfaction that transcended money. It was proof of his superiority, confirmation that he was smarter than everyone else, that he could commit the perfect crime again and again. But perfection is an illusion, and repetition breeds patterns. Somewhere in the dusty filing cabinets of insurance company offices, clerks were beginning to notice something unusual. The same name, or rather similar names, slight variations, kept appearing on beneficiary claims. Alfred Klein, Albert Klein, L. Klein. The deaths were in different states, the circumstances varied slightly, but there were similarities that troubled the more conscientious investigators. Young, healthy women marrying, becoming ill within months, dying suddenly. All cremated, all fully insured with recent policy updates. 1935 arrived with darkening clouds on the horizon, but Alfred Leonard Klein remained oblivious to the approaching storm. He'd refined his technique to such precision that he felt invincible, untouchable, protected by the sheer audacity of his crimes. After all, who would suspect that the charming, well-dressed gentleman weeping at his wife's funeral was actually her calculated murderer? Who would imagine that matrimony itself could be weaponized so effectively? His confidence was intoxicating and dangerous in equal measure. By now, Alfred had perfected what criminal psychologists would later term his signature, the unique pattern of behaviors that defined his methodology. He'd abandoned the Lonely Hearts columns as too traceable and had begun frequenting more subtle hunting grounds: widow support groups, church social events, charity fundraisers. These venues provided perfect cover. A man attending a grief counseling session appeared sensitive, emotionally available, spiritually grounded. The women he encountered in these spaces were vulnerable, seeking comfort, predisposed to trust someone who seemed to understand their pain. His fifth victim, or was it his sixth? Even Alfred was beginning to lose count, was a woman named Evelyn Cutter. She was 51, a widow whose husband had died in an automobile accident 3 years earlier, leaving her with a paid-off home in Portland, Oregon, and a substantial insurance settlement that she'd invested conservatively. Evelyn had never remarried, not from lack of interest, but from an abundance of caution. She'd watched too many of her widowed friends make hasty second marriages that ended in financial ruin or emotional devastation. But Alfred was patient. He understood that women like Evelyn required a longer courtship, a more elaborate performance. He attended her church for 6 months before even speaking to her, establishing himself as a fixture in the community. A respectable single man of means who contributed generously to the collection plate and volunteered for church functions. When he finally approached her after a Sunday service, it seemed organic, natural, the logical progression of a relationship that had been building silently for months. Their courtship stretched across an entire year. Alfred never rushed, never pushed, never showed the slightest hint of financial interest. He paid for every dinner, brought modest gifts, spoke eloquently about his desire for companionship rather than wealth. When Evelyn's friends questioned the relationship, where exactly was this charming man from? What was his occupation? Alfred had plausible answers prepared. He was a widower himself, he explained, a successful investor who'd lost his beloved wife to influenza. He'd moved to Portland for a fresh start, seeking peace and perhaps, if God willed it, a second chance at love. The wedding took place in October 1936, a small ceremony in the same church where they'd met. Evelyn wore cream-colored silk and carried orchids. Alfred wore his finest suit and a smile that photographs captured as tender and loving. The reception was tasteful, attended by Evelyn's friends and church community, all of whom remarked what a lovely couple they made, how Evelyn deserved this happiness after years of loneliness. 3 weeks later, Evelyn updated her insurance policy, making Alfred the sole beneficiary. 2 weeks after that, she began experiencing mysterious symptoms: nausea, weakness, difficulty breathing. The family doctor was puzzled. Evelyn had always been healthy, robust, active in her church and community. He prescribed rest, bland foods, tonics that seemed to provide temporary relief before the symptoms returned, stronger than before. Alfred played his role magnificently. He hired a private nurse, spared no expense on doctor's visits, sat at Evelyn's bedside reading scripture and holding her hand. When concerned friends visited, they found a devoted husband doing everything humanly possible to save his ailing wife. What they couldn't see was the poison being administered in carefully calibrated doses, disguised in the special broths Alfred prepared himself, mixed into the medicinal tinctures he insisted only he should handle. Evelyn Klein died on December 3, 1936, 72 days after her wedding. The death certificate listed acute respiratory failure secondary to pneumonia, a diagnosis the overworked coroner accepted without question. The funeral was well attended, the eulogy moving, the widower's grief apparently genuine. Alfred collected $47,000 from the insurance company, sold Evelyn's house for another $22,000, and departed Portland before Christmas. But cracks were forming in his perfect facade. An insurance investigator named Thomas Brennan had been tracking suspicious death claims for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and something about the Portland case troubled him deeply. The policy update so close to the wedding, the rapid onset of illness, the cremation despite the deceased's documented preference for traditional burial mentioned in church records. Brennan requested files on other recent claims paid to beneficiaries named Klein or similar variations. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Across 4 states, California, Oregon, Washington, and Nevada, at least 7 women had died under remarkably similar circumstances after marrying men who matched the same general description. Tall, handsome, well-dressed, somewhere between 40 and 50 years old, always a widower with a tragic backstory, always charming, always departing immediately after collecting the insurance payout. Brennan compiled his findings into a report and submitted it to his superiors. The response was frustratingly bureaucratic. Interesting patterns, certainly, but insurance fraud was civil matter, and without concrete proof of murder, autopsies, toxicology reports, bodies to examine, there was little the company could do beyond flagging the name for future claims. Local police departments showed even less interest. These deaths had occurred across multiple jurisdictions, and in the 1930s, coordination between law enforcement agencies was primitive at best. Besides, the women had died of natural causes, according to official death certificates. Without evidence of foul play, there was no crime to investigate. Alfred, blissfully unaware of Brennan's investigation, continued his deadly routine. 1937 brought 2 more marriages, 2 more murders, 2 more insurance payouts. The amounts were growing larger. He'd learned to target wealthier widows, women with substantial assets and generous insurance policies. His confidence had transformed into arrogance. He began taking unnecessary risks, staying in cities longer after the murders, spending money more flamboyantly, drinking too heavily in hotel bars where he sometimes boasted obliquely about his business success. It was during one of these drunken evenings in a Los Angeles hotel bar that Alfred made his first serious mistake. He'd been celebrating a recent $60,000 insurance payout, and the alcohol had loosened his usually careful tongue. He struck up a conversation with another man at the bar, a commercial traveler named Harold Grissom, and began spinning elaborate stories about his financial acumen, his talent for reading situations, his ability to identify opportunities others missed. The secret, Alfred slurred, leaning close to Grissom conspiratorially, is understanding what people want. Women especially. They want romance, security, someone to make them feel alive again. Give them that, and they'll give you everything else. Grissom, sensing something dark beneath the boastful surface, asked carefully, "What happens when they realize they've been conned?" Alfred's smile turned predatory. "They don't realize. They die happy." The words hung in the air between them, too specific to be entirely metaphorical, too disturbing to be dismissed as drunken rambling. Grissom excused himself shortly afterward, returning to his room where he spent the night troubled by the conversation. The next morning, he reported it to the hotel manager, who dismissed it as the nonsense of an intoxicated patron. But Grissom couldn't shake the feeling that he'd glimpsed something monstrous, and when he returned home to San Francisco, he mentioned the encounter to his wife, who mentioned it to her sister, who happened to work as a secretary at the district attorney's office. The information eventually reached Thomas Brennan, the insurance investigator who'd been tracking Alfred's pattern. This was the first potential witness, the first person who'd heard Alfred essentially confess to his crimes. Brennan traveled to San Francisco to interview Grissom, who provided a detailed description of the man from the bar and recalled the name he'd used. Alfred or Albert, something like that, Klein or Klein. Brennan now had enough to justify a formal investigation. He contacted police departments in every city where suspicious deaths had occurred, compiling case files, comparing witness descriptions, tracking insurance claims. The pattern became undeniable. The same man, using slight variations of the same name, had married at least 9 women across 5 years. All the women had died mysteriously. All had been insured. All had been cremated. and all the insurance payouts had been collected by the same individual. But Alfred Leonard Klein had vanished. After collecting his last payout in Los Angeles, he'd simply disappeared, leaving no forwarding address, no trace, no trail for investigators to follow. The monster had gone to ground, perhaps sensing that the net was finally tightening, perhaps simply moving to new hunting grounds where his face wasn't yet known. The years between 1938 and 1944 remained shrouded in mystery, a dark period when Alfred Leonard Klein existed in the shadows of American society, a phantom moving through wartime chaos that provided perfect cover for his murderous enterprises. World War II had transformed the nation, creating unprecedented opportunities for a man who specialized in exploiting disorder and displacement. Millions of men had shipped overseas, leaving behind widows in waiting and lonely wives uncertain whether their husbands would return. Rationing created black markets. The draft created labor shortages. And the general atmosphere of crisis and uncertainty meant that authorities had bigger concerns than investigating middle-aged women dying of apparently natural causes. Thomas Brennan, the insurance investigator who'd first identified the pattern, had been drafted himself, spending 3 years in North Africa and Italy before returning home to find his investigation essentially abandoned. The files he'd so carefully compiled had been relegated to archive storage, marked inactive by a department overwhelmed with wartime fraud cases. But Brennan couldn't let it go. During quiet moments in military camps, during long nights on transport ships, he'd thought about those 9 women, possibly more, who'd trusted the wrong man and paid with their lives. When he returned to civilian life in late 1945, Brennan requested his old case files and began again. The trail had gone cold, but he had advantages now. The FBI had expanded dramatically during the war, developing sophisticated record-keeping systems and interstate communication networks. Brennan contacted the Bureau explaining his theory: a serial predator who married women, insured them, murdered them, and moved on. The agent who took his call was initially skeptical. This sounded like pulp fiction, not reality, but agreed to run the names through the new centralized database. The results were staggering. Not 9 victims, but potentially 16. The FBI had records of insurance claims filed by men matching Alfred's description in Texas, Louisiana, Missouri, and Illinois, states Brennan hadn't even considered. The wartime years had been extraordinarily productive for Alfred Leonard Klein. With millions of Americans in motion, families displaced, women struggling alone, he'd found endless opportunities to practice his deadly craft. But the FBI also found something else: a recent marriage certificate from Shawnee County, Kansas, dated April 1945. A man named Albert Leonard Klein, note the spelling variation, had married a widow named Delilah Walker. The marriage license listed Klein's occupation as investment counselor and his age as 52. Brennan felt electricity course through his veins. This was him. This was the monster. And if the pattern held, Delilah Walker was already being poisoned, already dying, already lost. Brennan traveled to Kansas immediately, driving through the night, praying he wasn't too late. He arrived in Topeka on a sweltering August morning and went directly to the address listed on the marriage certificate. The house was modest but well-maintained, sitting on a quiet street where children played and neighbors tended gardens. Brennan knocked on the door, his heart hammering, unsure what he'd find. A woman answered, thin, pale, moving slowly as if each step required tremendous effort. This was Delilah Walker, or rather Delilah Klein now, and she was clearly unwell. Brennan introduced himself carefully, showing his credentials, explaining that he was conducting a routine insurance investigation. Could he perhaps speak with her husband? Albert isn't here, Delilah said, her voice weak. He's traveling for business. He'll be back next week. Brennan's mind raced. He couldn't reveal his true purpose without evidence, couldn't make accusations that might alert Alfred and send him running. But he also couldn't leave this woman here to die. He tried a different approach. Mrs. Klein, I apologize for the intrusion, but you seem quite ill. Have you been seeing a doctor? Delilah nodded. Dr. Morrison. He says it's my stomach, some kind of infection. Albert's been wonderful, taking such good care of me. preparing special meals, giving me tonics. The tonics, of course. Brennan felt sick. Mrs. Klein, I wonder if I might examine these tonics? It's possible that insurance regulations require certain medications to be documented for policy purposes. It was a transparent lie, but Delilah was too weak to question it. She led him to the kitchen where several brown bottles sat on the counter, labeled in Alfred's distinctive handwriting. Stomach remedy, digestive aid, strength tonic. Brennan carefully pocketed one bottle, promising to return it shortly, and excused himself. He drove directly to the office of the county coroner, a gruff man named Henderson who'd seen everything during 30 years in the job. Brennan explained the situation, showed him the compiled case files, and handed over the tonic bottle. Henderson listened with growing alarm, then opened the bottle and sniffed carefully. I can't be certain without chemical analysis, Henderson said slowly, but if I had to guess, I'd say this contains arsenic. Maybe other compounds too. Whoever's been drinking this has been poisoning themselves slowly, systematically. Brennan felt vindication and horror in equal measure. We need to arrest him immediately, and we need to get Mrs. Klein to a hospital. On what charge? Henderson asked practically. You've got a bottle of possibly poisoned liquid and a theory. You don't have proof that this man, Klein or whatever his name is the one who poisoned it. Any half-decent lawyer would get the case dismissed before trial. But Henderson agreed to contact the police and request that Albert Klein be brought in for questioning when he returned. In the meantime, Brennan convinced Delilah to allow herself to be admitted to the hospital for treatment of her mysterious illness. She was reluctant. Albert would be worried when he came home to an empty house, but her condition had deteriorated enough that she couldn't refuse. At the hospital, doctors pumped her stomach, administered chelation therapy to remove heavy metals from her system, and watched in astonishment as her condition began improving almost immediately. The head physician, Dr. Samuel Cross, had seen enough arsenic poisoning during the war to recognize it when presented with a textbook case. Delilah Walker had been systematically poisoned over several months, probably beginning shortly after her marriage. Alfred returned to Kansas 5 days later, letting himself into the house with his key, calling cheerfully for his wife. Police were waiting. The arrest was anticlimactic, no dramatic chase, no violent resistance. Alfred simply stared at the officers for a long moment, then smiled that same charming smile he'd deployed so successfully for 15 years, and asked calmly, "On what charge?" "Suspicion of attempted murder," the lead detective said. "Your wife is alive, by the way. She's in the hospital recovering nicely now that she's stopped drinking your tonics." For the first time in decades, Alfred's mask slipped. His face went white, then red, and something murderous flashed in his eyes before the charm snapped back into place. "I have no idea what you're talking about. My wife has been ill, yes, but I've been caring for her devotedly. If someone has poisoned her, I'm as shocked as you are." But the evidence was mounting. Chemical analysis of the tonic bottles showed lethal concentrations of arsenic and antimony, metallic poisons that would have killed Delilah within weeks if Brennan hadn't intervened. A search of Alfred's belongings uncovered insurance policies on Delilah totaling $95,000, all recently purchased, all listing him as sole beneficiary. And when police began circulating Alfred's photograph to authorities nationwide, the floodgates opened. From California to Louisiana, from Oregon to Illinois, police departments reported unsolved deaths that matched the pattern. Detectives who'd dismissed earlier suspicions as paranoid speculation now reopened files with fresh eyes. Crematoriums were contacted, funeral homes questioned, marriage records examined. The scope of Alfred Leonard Klein's killing spree began to emerge in horrifying detail. But proving murder when the victims had been cremated years earlier proved nearly impossible. The bodies were gone, destroyed by fire, reduced to ash and scattered. Without physical evidence, without tissue samples for toxicology, prosecutors could only charge Alfred with the attempted murder of Delilah Walker. Everything else, the 9 confirmed victims, possibly 7 more, perhaps as many as 20 over 15 years, would remain technically unproven, relegated to the realm of strong suspicion rather than legal certainty. The trial began in February 1946 in a Topeka courtroom packed with journalists from across the nation. The war was over, and Americans were hungry for sensational stories to fill newspapers no longer dominated by combat reports. The case of the Bluebeard Killer, as the press had dubbed Alfred, referencing the fairy tale murderer of wives, provided exactly the lurid details that sold papers. Delilah Walker testified from a wheelchair, still weak from the poisoning but recovering. She described Alfred's courtship, his attentiveness, the special meals and tonics he'd insisted she consume. The prosecution presented the chemical analysis showing lethal poisons in the tonics. Insurance investigators testified about the pattern of deaths across multiple states. Harold Grissom, the commercial traveler who'd encountered a drunken Alfred in that Los Angeles bar years earlier, described the disturbing conversation about women dying happy. The defense strategy was brazen. Admit nothing, deny everything, attack the prosecution's evidence as circumstantial. Alfred's lawyer argued that the tonics could have been tampered with by anyone, that the insurance policies were simply prudent financial planning, that his client was the victim of a conspiracy theory run amok. Alfred himself took the stand, proclaiming his innocence with wounded dignity, insisting that he'd loved all his wives devotedly and was devastated by their deaths. It was a remarkable performance, but the jury wasn't convinced. The pattern was too clear, the evidence too damning, the coincidences too numerous to dismiss. After just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict: guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold March morning, the kind of day where winter refuses to relinquish its grip despite spring's approach. Alfred Leonard Klein stood before Judge Marcus Thornton, dressed impeccably as always, his expression neutral, betraying nothing of whatever thoughts churned behind those cold, calculating eyes. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of court reporters' pens and the occasional muffled sob from the gallery where victims' family members had gathered. Judge Thornton had spent sleepless nights reviewing the case files, reading about each suspected victim, contemplating the scope of evil that could drive a man to transform marriage, that most sacred of human bonds, into a murder weapon. Now, looking down at the defendant, he spoke in a voice heavy with controlled fury. "Mr. Klein, in my 30 years on the bench, I have sentenced thieves, rapists, murderers of passion, and killers of cold calculation. But never have I encountered someone who weaponized trust itself, who turned love into a death sentence, who systematically hunted the vulnerable and lonely with such methodical cruelty. The law permits me to sentence you only for the attempted murder of Delilah Walker, but make no mistake, we all know the full extent of your crimes." The judge paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "You married at least 9 women, possibly as many as 20, across 15 years. You courted them with false tenderness. You convinced them they'd found safety, partnership, love. And then you poisoned them slowly, watching them deteriorate, playing the concerned husband while secretly counting down to the insurance payout. You didn't kill for passion or even simple greed. You killed because you could, because it gave you pleasure, because you viewed human beings as resources to be exploited and discarded." Alfred's lawyer stood to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. "Counsel, your client has been convicted. I'm now speaking to the broader record because future generations need to understand what stood before us here today. Not a man driven by desperation or mental defect, but a predator of exceptional cunning who chose evil as deliberately as others choose virtue." Judge Thornton sentenced Alfred Leonard Klein to the maximum penalty allowable under Kansas law: life imprisonment with hard labor, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Given Alfred's age, he was 57 at sentencing. This was effectively a death sentence, though not the execution many in the courtroom believed he deserved. Alfred was transported to the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, a forbidding Gothic structure that housed the state's most dangerous criminals. If he expected special treatment based on his previous ability to charm and manipulate, he was quickly disabused of that notion. The prison population had no patience for men who murdered women. Within his first week, Alfred was attacked twice by other inmates. He learned to keep his head down, to avoid conversation, to survive in an environment where his silver tongue and expensive suits meant nothing. But even behind bars, Alfred's story wasn't finished. Thomas Brennan, the insurance investigator who devoted years to tracking the Bluebeard killer, continued his research with obsessive dedication. He wanted to identify every victim, to give names to the women who'd been reduced to statistics in case files. Working with law enforcement across multiple states, Brennan painstakingly reconstructed Alfred's movements from 1930 to 1945. The confirmed death toll eventually reached 14 women, 14 separate lives cut short, 14 funerals where Alfred had wept crocodile tears, 14 insurance payouts totaling more than $350,000, equivalent to millions in modern currency. But Brennan suspected there were more, victims whose deaths had been so skillfully disguised as natural causes that they'd never appeared on anyone's radar. The families of the confirmed victims began contacting each other, forming a network of shared grief and righteous anger. Evelyn Cutter's sister, Patricia, became a fierce advocate for reform of insurance regulations and death investigation procedures. She testified before the Kansas state legislature, arguing for mandatory autopsies in cases where significant insurance payouts were involved, for better interstate coordination between law enforcement agencies, for stricter oversight of marriage and insurance records to identify suspicious patterns. Some reforms were implemented. Insurance companies began sharing data about beneficiary claims more systematically. Medical examiners received additional funding and training in toxicology. But the changes came too late for Alfred's victims, too late for the women who'd believed they'd found love in their twilight years, and instead found only death. Inside the prison, Alfred gradually deteriorated. The hard labor, working the prison farm, hauling stone, performing manual tasks his body wasn't conditioned for, took a physical toll. But more devastating was the psychological impact. Alfred had spent decades as the hunter, the manipulator, the one in control. Now he was powerless, trapped, reduced to a number and a cell. His fellow inmates despised him. The guards treated him with cold indifference. There was no one to charm, no performance that would improve his situation. In 1948, 2 years into his sentence, Alfred suffered the first of several strokes. The prison physician determined he'd developed cardiovascular disease, likely exacerbated by years of high living, heavy drinking, and the sudden shock of imprisonment. Alfred's left side was partially paralyzed, his speech slurred. The charming facade was gone, replaced by the physical reality of a damaged, declining body. Delilah Walker, the woman whose life Brennan had saved, attempted to rebuild her existence after the trial. She sold her house in Kansas, unable to bear living in the place where she'd been systematically poisoned, and moved to Colorado to live with her daughter. For years, she struggled with nightmares and trust issues, unable to reconcile the kind, attentive husband she'd believed Alfred to be with the calculated killer he actually was. She attended therapy sessions where doctors explained how predators like Alfred selected victims, how manipulation worked, how none of it had been her fault. But knowledge didn't erase the trauma. In 1952, Delilah published a short memoir titled, "I Married the Bluebeard Killer," detailing her experience and warning other women about the signs she'd missed. The book became a modest bestseller, partly due to morbid curiosity, but also because it provided genuine insight into the psychology of predatory relationships. Delilah donated all proceeds to organizations supporting widows and advocating for domestic violence victims. Alfred read the book in prison. An inmate working in the library smuggled him a copy, curious to see how the notorious Bluebeard killer would react to his surviving victim's account. Alfred's response was chilling. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound from his stroke-damaged throat, and told the inmate, "She still doesn't understand. None of them ever did. I gave them what they wanted. Romance, attention, someone who saw them as valuable. The fact that it ended with their deaths was simply the necessary conclusion of the transaction. They got what they paid for." This statement, relayed by the inmate to prison authorities and eventually to journalists, crystallized the true horror of Alfred Leonard Klein. He felt no remorse, no guilt, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with inherent worth. To the very end, He viewed them as transactions, as resources, as means to an end. The charm, the romance, the promises, all had been theater, performance art designed to facilitate murder. In January 1956, Alfred suffered a massive stroke that left him completely paralyzed and unable to speak. He lingered for 3 months in the prison hospital ward, conscious but trapped in a body that no longer responded to his commands. The physicians who attended him noted the bitter irony. Alfred had poisoned his victims slowly, watching them deteriorate while maintaining the pretense of care. Now he experienced his own slow deterioration, unable to control his fate, unable to manipulate or charm his way out of the inevitable conclusion. Alfred Leonard Klein died on April 17, 1956, at age 68. His death certificate listed cerebrovascular accident, a stroke, as the cause. There was no funeral, no mourners, no ceremony. His body was cremated, just as he'd arranged for all his victims, and his ashes were disposed of without marker or memorial. In death as in life, Alfred was reduced to nothing more than dust and forgotten history. But his legacy persisted in ways he never imagined. The case of the Bluebeard killer became a foundational study in criminal psychology, taught in universities and police academies as an example of serial predation targeting vulnerable populations. Researchers analyzed his methodology, his victim selection, his psychological profile. The FBI included his case in their developing database of serial killers, using it to establish patterns and warning signs for future investigations. Thomas Brennan, who'd dedicated years to tracking Alfred, retired from insurance investigation in 1960, but continued working as a consultant on suspicious death cases. He gave lectures at law enforcement conferences, emphasizing the importance of recognizing patterns across jurisdictions, of taking seriously the concerns of family members who suspected foul play, of never dismissing deaths as natural, simply because victims were older or infirm. Brennan passed away in 1979, having spent his later years ensuring that Alfred Klein's victims were remembered as human beings rather than statistics. The women Alfred murdered left behind families who grieved, communities that mourned, and a painful question that echoed through the decades. How could someone seem so normal, so charming, so trustworthy, while harboring such monstrous intent? It was a question without satisfying answers, because the truth was uncomfortable. Evil didn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wore an expensive suit, brought flowers on the first date, and whispered words of love while planning murder. In modern America, Alfred's crimes would be far more difficult to commit. Computerized databases track insurance policies across states. Death investigations follow stricter protocols. Background checks reveal criminal histories and suspicious patterns. But technology alone doesn't eliminate the threat of predators who target the vulnerable. Every year, con artists and killers seek out lonely people, building false relationships designed to exploit trust for profit or pleasure or both. The legacy of Alfred Leonard Klein stands as a grim reminder that vigilance matters, that patterns tell stories, that instinct deserves respect. The women he killed had often expressed concerns to friends, had mentioned things that seemed off about their whirlwind romances, had questioned the speed at which their charming suitors pushed toward marriage and insurance arrangements. But social pressure to give people the benefit of the doubt, to not seem suspicious or paranoid, had silenced those concerns. Those women had ignored their own instincts, and it cost them everything. Today, in cold case files across America, there are likely more victims of Alfred Leonard Klein, women whose deaths were never connected to his killing spree, whose cremated remains eliminated any possibility of posthumous justice, whose families never learned that their mother or sister or aunt had been murdered rather than dying of natural causes. The true body count will never be known with certainty. 14 confirmed victims, perhaps 20, possibly more. The monster is gone, reduced to ash and bad memory, but the damage persists, rippling through generations, a testament to what happens when society fails to protect its vulnerable members, when patterns go unrecognized, when charm is mistaken for character, and when evil wears a smile that never reaches its eyes. The Bluebeard killer is dead. But his story survives as warning, as lesson, as reminder that the worst monsters often look the most human. and that the price of trusting the wrong person can be measured in lives destroyed, futures stolen, and a darkness that no amount of justice can fully illuminate. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Architect of Annihilation. Some men don't just cross the line between sanity and madness. They erase it entirely, taking innocent lives with them into the abyss. What happens when an educated mind becomes a weapon, and the person you trust most is orchestrating your destruction? We hunt predators who lurk in shadows, but what happens when the predator wears a lab coat, carries a briefcase, and sits across from you at the dinner table? Tonight, we descend into the chilling reality of Alexander Lebutkin, a man whose intelligence became his deadliest weapon, whose precision turned ordinary moments into orchestrated nightmares, and whose calculated cruelty left a trail of devastation that still haunts those who survived his reign of terror. This isn't just a story about murder. This is about the terrifying truth that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who know exactly how to make death look like anything but what it is. Buckle up, because the darkness we're about to explore doesn't just chill the blood, it freezes the soul. Alexander Lebutkin appeared, by all accounts, to be the embodiment of success, a man who had climbed the ladder of respectability with methodical determination. Born into a working-class family in Russia during the turbulent final years of the Soviet Union, he understood early that survival demanded more than luck. It required strategy, intelligence, and an ability to read people like open books. Those who knew him in his youth recalled a boy who spoke little but observed everything, whose eyes seemed to calculate angles and outcomes before most children learned to tie their shoes. By his early 20s, Lebutkin had secured an education that set him apart from his peers. Chemistry became his obsession, a field where precision mattered, where understanding the invisible bonds between elements could unlock doors most people didn't even know existed. He wasn't just good at it, he was exceptional, the type of student professors remembered years later, the one who asked questions that made even seasoned academics pause and reconsider their assumptions. But brilliance, as history has shown us time and again, is not synonymous with morality. Intelligence without empathy creates something far more dangerous than ignorance ever could. His colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry described him as meticulous to the point of obsession. Every calculation checked 3 times, every hypothesis tested until no doubt remained, every detail scrutinized under the harsh light of his exacting standards. He climbed corporate ranks not through charisma but through undeniable competence, becoming the person management turned to when problems needed solving, when questions demanded answers, when failure simply wasn't an option. His workspace remained immaculate, bottles arranged by size and alphabetical order, notes written in handwriting so precise it could have been computer-generated, nothing left to chance or chaos. Yet beneath this veneer of professional excellence, something twisted had taken root. Those closest to Lebutkin began noticing peculiarities that didn't quite fit the image of the dedicated scientist. His wife, Marina, mentioned to friends, always in hushed tones, always with nervous laughter designed to diminish the weight of her words, that Alexander seemed increasingly distant, increasingly consumed by projects he refused to discuss. Their marriage, which had begun with the hopeful energy of 2 young people building a future, had calcified into something cold and transactional. Conversations became logistical exchanges about bills and schedules. Physical intimacy evaporated like morning dew under harsh sunlight, and the emotional connection that once bound them dissolved into uncomfortable silence. Marina's sister, Olga, visited their apartment one autumn evening and immediately sensed something profoundly wrong. The space felt sterile, more laboratory than home, with Alexander's personal effects dominating every room. Books on toxicology stacked in perfect towers, scientific journals spread across surfaces, handwritten notes covering walls in what appeared to be coded language only he could decipher. When she mentioned her concern to Marina, her sister's response chilled her. "He says he's working on something important, something that will change everything. The words hung between them like a threat neither woman fully understood, but both instinctively feared. Neighbors in their apartment complex rarely saw Alexander engage in normal social interactions. He didn't attend building meetings, didn't exchange pleasantries in hallways, didn't participate in the casual rhythms of communal living that defined their neighborhood. One resident recalled passing his door late one night and hearing sounds, not music or television, but a methodical clinking of glass, the precise movements of someone conducting experiments in the dead hours when most people dreamed. When asked about it later, the neighbor shuddered. It sounded like a surgeon at work, every movement deliberate, every action purposeful. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and that terrified me more than any scream could have. Alexander's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent, a slow erosion of whatever humanity had once existed beneath his calculating exterior. Friends from university who encountered him years later barely recognized the man they'd studied alongside. Where once existed at least a pretense of warmth, now resided only cold assessment. Conversations felt like interrogations, questions probed for weakness, and his eyes, those pale, unblinking eyes, seemed to measure everyone against some internal standard known only to him. One former classmate, speaking anonymously years later, captured the unease perfectly. Talking to Alexander was like being X-rayed. You felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see straight through flesh and bone to catalog every flaw, every fear, every point where pressure could be applied to maximum effect. But the most disturbing aspect of Labutkin's persona wasn't his coldness or his obsessive nature. It was his patience. Unlike impulsive criminals who act on rage or desperation, Alexander possessed the temperament of a chess master, willing to wait months or even years for the perfect moment to execute his plans. This patience, combined with his expertise in chemistry, created a predator unlike almost any other, one who could weaponize the invisible, who understood how substances moved through human systems, who knew precisely which compounds could mimic natural death and which would raise immediate suspicion. He had turned his education into something sinister, his intellect into an instrument of destruction, and his profession into the perfect cover for activities that would soon shock investigators and horrify an entire community. Marina's health began deteriorating in ways that puzzled doctors. Fatigue that couldn't be explained by lifestyle factors, digestive issues that came and went without clear triggers, headaches that struck with increasing frequency and intensity. Medical professionals ran tests that revealed nothing conclusive, prescribed treatments that provided no relief, and ultimately attributed her declining condition to stress or psychosomatic factors, the default diagnosis when science fails to identify concrete causes. She lost weight, her skin took on a grayish pallor, and her once vibrant energy drained away like water through cupped hands. Through it all, Alexander played the concerned husband perfectly, accompanying her to appointments, asking detailed questions about medications and treatments, researching her symptoms with the thoroughness everyone expected from a man of his scientific background. No one suspected that the person most invested in understanding her illness was the same person causing it. The final weeks before everything unraveled found Alexander at his most active. Neighbors reported seeing him leave the apartment at odd hours carrying bags and cases whose contents remained mysteriously concealed. His behavior at work became increasingly erratic, arriving late, leaving early, distracted during meetings, his attention clearly consumed by matters beyond his professional responsibilities. One coworker, brave enough to ask if everything was all right, received a response that stopped her cold. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. The words themselves were innocuous, but the delivery, flat, emotionless, containing neither warmth nor humanity, suggested something far darker than workplace stress or personal problems. It was the statement of someone executing a carefully designed protocol, someone for whom human concerns had become mere variables in a larger equation. And then, in the gray morning hours of an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, Marina Labutkin stopped breathing. The emergency call came at 6:47 a.m., Alexander's voice trembling with what paramedics later described as textbook shock, controlled enough to provide necessary information, distressed enough to seem genuinely devastated. They arrived within minutes to find Marina's body already growing cold, Alexander kneeling beside her with tears streaming down his face, his performance of grief so convincing that first responders focused entirely on failed resuscitation efforts rather than suspicious circumstances. She was only 34 years old, had no known serious health conditions, and by all accounts should have had decades of life ahead of her. Yet here she lay, lifeless on the bedroom floor, her death as sudden as it was inexplicable. Initial examination suggested natural causes, perhaps a heart arrhythmia, possibly a stroke, maybe an aneurysm that had been silently waiting to claim her life. These things happened, tragic and random, especially to people who seemed healthy until the moment they weren't. The responding physician signed off on preliminary paperwork indicating no obvious signs of foul play, no visible trauma, no immediate red flags that would mandate criminal investigation. In most cases, this would have been the end of scrutiny, the beginning of burial arrangements and grieving processes. But Marina's sister Olga refused to accept the convenient explanation. Olga had been haunted by her last conversation with Marina, a phone call just 3 days before her death. Her sister's voice had carried an edge of fear she'd never heard before, a trembling quality that suggested terror barely held in check. "If something happens to me," Marina had whispered, "promise you'll look closely. Promise you won't just accept whatever they tell you." When Olga pressed for details, Marina backtracked, claiming stress and exhaustion. But the words lingered like a curse, taking on horrifying new meaning when the death notification came. Now, standing in the morgue looking at her sister's too still face, those words thundered through Olga's mind with the force of accusation and prophecy combined. She demanded an autopsy, insisted despite Alexander's protests that Marina had been deeply religious and would have wanted immediate burial according to traditional customs. She pushed back against pressure from other family members who saw her insistence as disrespectful, as extending grief rather than allowing healing to begin. She threatened to involve media, to make enough noise that authorities would have no choice but to investigate thoroughly. Her persistence bordered on obsession, driven by instinct and remembered fear, by the certainty that something profound and terrible had been hidden beneath the surface of her sister's life. Finally, after days of bureaucratic resistance and family tension, the local prosecutor's office agreed to a comprehensive toxicology screening. The results took 3 weeks to process, 3 weeks during which Alexander played the devastated widower with Emmy-worthy consistency. He hosted a funeral attended by dozens of mourners, spoke at the service about loss and love with words carefully calibrated to suggest depth of feeling, and accepted condolences with the appropriate mixture of gratitude and sorrow. He cleaned out Marina's belongings with efficient thoroughness, donating clothes and personal items before anyone could request mementos, disposing of medications and beauty products, erasing her presence from their shared space with a speed that struck some as indecent but others interpreted as a grieving man unable to face constant reminders of his loss. Only Olga noticed how quickly he worked, how systematically he eliminated anything that had belonged to his wife, how eager he seemed to close this chapter and move forward. When the toxicology report finally landed on Detective Yuri Volkov's desk, it detonated like a bomb in the quiet police station. Marina's blood contained thallium levels roughly 200 times higher than normal baseline, a concentration impossible to achieve through environmental exposure or accidental ingestion. Thallium, Volkov knew from his research, was a heavy metal once used in rat poison, a substance banned in many countries precisely because of its deadly effectiveness and the difficulty in detecting its presence. Colorless, tasteless, odorless, it could be administered gradually over weeks or months, accumulating in the victim's system until reaching lethal concentrations. Symptoms mimicked various illnesses: fatigue, neurological problems, digestive issues, making diagnosis nearly impossible until autopsy revealed the truth. It was, in short, the poison of choice for someone who understood chemistry, someone patient enough to kill slowly, someone confident enough in their knowledge to believe they could commit the perfect murder. The investigation pivoted immediately from routine death inquiry to homicide, with Alexander Labutkin becoming the primary suspect within hours of the toxicology results being confirmed. Volkov assembled a team and began the methodical process of deconstructing the scientist's carefully maintained facade. They interviewed co-workers who reluctantly admitted Alexander had access to various chemical compounds through his pharmaceutical work, though tracking specific substances proved difficult given the company's lax inventory controls. They spoke with neighbors who recalled the late-night sounds of laboratory activity, the odd smells that occasionally drifted from the Labutkin apartment, the sense that something unnatural was happening behind closed doors. They examined financial records that showed Alexander had purchased insurance policies on Marina's life totaling nearly 500,000 rubles just 18 months before her death, policies she'd apparently signed without fully understanding their implications. But the most damning evidence came from Marina's medical records, which painted a horrifying picture when viewed through the lens of thallium poisoning. Every symptom she'd reported, the weakness, the numbness in her extremities, the hair loss she'd attributed to stress, the vision problems, the confusion, aligned perfectly with gradual heavy metal poisoning. Doctors' notes documented her declining condition over a 6-month period, a steady deterioration that multiple physicians had failed to connect to toxicological causes because they weren't looking for them. One neurologist had even suggested the possibility of heavy metal exposure, but dismissed it when initial screening came back negative, not realizing that thallium required specific testing rather than standard panels. Alexander, with his scientific knowledge, would have known exactly which tests to fear and which Marina's doctors were unlikely to order. The investigative team obtained a warrant to search the Labutkin apartment, descending on the space with forensic specialists and evidence collection protocols. What they discovered transformed suspicion into certainty, theory into provable fact. Hidden in a locked cabinet in Alexander's home office, a cabinet Marina's sister confirmed her sister had never been allowed to access. Investigators found a cache of materials that read like a poisoner's instruction manual. Bottles of thallium acetate, labeled in Alexander's precise handwriting, sat alongside detailed journals documenting dosage calculations, administration schedules, and observations of effects. He had literally documented his wife's murder, recording her symptoms with the detachment of a scientist monitoring a laboratory experiment, noting which amounts produced which reactions, adjusting his approach based on her body's responses. But the journals contained more than just Marina's death protocol. Pages upon pages detailed other subjects, identified only by initials and dates, suggesting a pattern of experimentation that extended far beyond a single victim. Volkov's blood ran cold as he read entries describing symptoms and outcomes, successes and failures, lessons learned from previous attempts. Some entries dated back nearly 5 years, implying a long history of activity that had gone completely undetected. The detective realized with growing horror that they weren't dealing with a man who had killed his wife in a moment of rage or even calculated malice. They were confronting a serial poisoner who had been perfecting his craft for years, using human beings as test subjects in a grotesque parody of scientific methodology. Additional evidence emerged from Alexander's work computer, which forensic analysts cracked despite sophisticated encryption. Search histories revealed extensive research into poisons, investigative techniques, autopsy procedures, and methods for avoiding detection. He'd studied famous poisoning cases throughout history, analyzing what went wrong, how killers were caught, which mistakes to avoid. He'd downloaded academic papers on toxicology, pharmacokinetics, and post-mortem detection methods. He'd even joined online forums where true crime enthusiasts discussed famous cases, asking seemingly innocent questions that actually probed for information on investigative weaknesses and forensic blind spots. The digital trail painted a portrait of a man who approached murder with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to his professional work, someone who viewed killing as an intellectual challenge rather than a moral transgression. When detectives finally arrested Alexander Labutkin, he showed no surprise, no panic, no emotion whatsoever. He simply nodded, extended his wrists for handcuffs, and walked calmly to the patrol car while neighbors watched in stunned disbelief. The man they'd lived beside for years, the quiet scientist who kept to himself, was being led away in chains for murder. Not a crime of passion, not a momentary loss of control, but something far more calculated and infinitely more chilling. As they drove toward the station, Detective Volkov studied Alexander's reflection in the rearview mirror. The suspect's face remained utterly blank, not frightened or defiant, just Empty. It was the expression of someone watching events unfold with detached curiosity. Someone for whom even his own arrest was just another data point in an ongoing experiment. The interrogation room at the Central Police Station had witnessed countless confessions, denials, breakdowns, and performances over the years, but Detective Volkov had never encountered anyone quite like Alexander Labutkin. Most suspects displayed some recognizable human emotion: fear, anger, remorse, defiance. But Alexander sat perfectly still, hands folded on the metal table, expression neutral, eyes focused on some point in the middle distance, as if he were attending a mildly boring lecture rather than facing evidence of multiple murders. His breathing remained steady, pulse unremarkable, body language completely relaxed. He could have been waiting for a bus. Volkov opened with standard procedures, reading rights and establishing the recording for legal purposes, before shifting into questioning. "Tell me about your wife, Alexander. Tell me about Marina." The detective watched carefully for micro-expressions, for tells that might reveal deception or emotional investment. Nothing. Alexander considered the question with the same thoughtful deliberation he might apply to a chemistry problem, then began speaking in a voice devoid of inflection or sentiment. "Marina was suitable," he began, the word choice immediately striking Volkov as profoundly wrong. "When we married, she met certain criteria I had established: compliant, not overly inquisitive, isolated enough from extended family that interference would be minimal. I recognized early that I would eventually need to remove her from the equation, but she served a purpose for a time, provided domestic stability, maintained the appearance of normalcy, gave me access to life insurance funds that would finance future projects." He spoke of his wife, the woman he'd vowed to love and cherish, as if describing a piece of laboratory equipment that had outlived its usefulness. The detective's stomach turned, but he maintained professional composure. "Future projects? What future projects required your wife's death?" Alexander's lips curved into something that might generously be called a smile, but contained no warmth, no humanity, only a kind of cold satisfaction that someone finally understood enough to ask the right questions. "You've seen the journals," Alexander replied, stating fact rather than posing a question. "You understand this went beyond Marina. She was simply the most recent iteration, the refinement of techniques I'd been developing for years. Each subject taught me something: how different body types metabolize compounds, how various pre-existing conditions affect timelines, which symptoms prompt immediate medical intervention versus which doctors dismiss as stress-related. Marina's death was supposed to be perfect, the culmination of everything I'd learned. The fact that you're sitting across from me suggests I miscalculated somewhere, though I haven't yet determined where the flaw in my methodology occurred." Volkov fought to keep his voice level. "There were others? How many others?" Alexander tilted his head, considering the question with the same analytical detachment he'd shown throughout the interview. Defining others becomes complicated. Some subjects survived with no awareness they'd been part of experiments, low-dose exposures designed to test symptoms without achieving lethality. Others experienced outcomes similar to Marina's. Exact numbers seem less important than the data collected, don't you think? The detective wanted to scream, to rage at the monster sitting calmly before him, but years of experience overrode emotional response. Instead, he methodically walked Alexander through the evidence, watching for any crack in the facade. The journals, the chemicals, the insurance policies, the medical records, each piece was presented and examined. Alexander acknowledged every item without evasion or excuse, occasionally correcting minor details or expanding on entries when he felt the investigators had misinterpreted his notes. He showed more emotion discussing errors in their analysis than he did talking about the human beings he'd poisoned. This entry here, Volkov indicated a page from 3 years prior, the initials PR and a series of dosage notes followed by subject deceased, complications from excessive administration. Who was PR? Alexander consulted the journal as if refreshing his memory, then nodded. Pavel Romanov, a colleague from my previous employer. He'd discovered certain irregularities in inventory records, nothing that definitively implicated me, but enough to warrant concern. I accelerated the timeline, which proved logistically necessary but scientifically disappointing. The data from his case was largely unusable due to the rushed nature of administration. The confession continued for hours, Alexander methodically detailing a campaign of poisoning that spanned nearly a decade and encompassed at least 7 confirmed victims, possibly more whose cases remained buried in natural death statistics. Each murder had been carefully planned and executed, each victim selected for specific reasons: personal convenience, elimination of threats, simple curiosity about how different variables would affect outcomes. He described dosing schedules with the same professional precision he'd likely once used in legitimate pharmaceutical research, discussed symptom observation with scientific detachment, and evaluated each death as either success or failure based entirely on whether it had achieved desired effects without raising suspicion. What emerged from the interrogation was a portrait of psychopathy so profound it bordered on incomprehensible. Alexander demonstrated no capacity for empathy, no recognition of his victims as human beings rather than experimental subjects, no remorse for the suffering he'd inflicted or the lives he'd ended. When Volkov described Marina's sister's grief, the pain of family members left behind, Alexander listened with polite attention but obvious incomprehension, as if the detective were speaking a foreign language. Emotional consequences simply didn't register within his psychological framework. They were irrelevant data points in calculations that concerned only practical outcomes and scientific results. Forensic psychologists who later evaluated Alexander struggled to fully capture the depths of his dysfunction. He displayed classic antisocial personality traits: lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, violation of social norms, but taken to extremes rarely encountered even among hardened criminals. His intelligence, rather than tempering his pathology, had amplified it, providing tools to act on impulses most people couldn't fathom entertaining. One evaluator compared him to historical figures like H. Holmes or Harold Shipman, medical professionals who'd weaponized their expertise, but noted that Alexander exceeded even those infamous killers in terms of pure detachment and systematic approach. He doesn't kill because he enjoys it or because he's driven by compulsion, the psychologist wrote in her report. He kills because human life simply doesn't register as meaningful in his internal universe. We're not dealing with a monster who struggles with evil impulses. We're dealing with someone for whom the concept of evil doesn't exist because empathy doesn't exist. He's a void in human form. As investigators dug deeper, the true scope of Alexander's activities became horrifyingly clear. Cross-referencing his employment history with unexplained deaths in various locations revealed a pattern that had been invisible when examined in isolation but became unmistakable when viewed comprehensively. Everywhere Alexander worked, unusual deaths clustered in greater numbers than statistical probability could explain. Colleagues who died suddenly of apparent heart attacks. Neighbors who succumbed to mysterious illnesses. Acquaintances who simply stopped showing up one day, their deaths attributed to natural causes after cursory investigation. Not every death could be definitively linked to Alexander, but the pattern suggested he'd been operating with near impunity for his entire adult life, protected by his intelligence, his professional credibility, and a system ill-equipped to detect careful, patient poisoners. The investigation expanded internationally when Interpol flagged similarities between Alexander's methods and several cold cases in neighboring countries. During a period when he'd worked briefly in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, deaths matching his signature had occurred in both locations, gradual declines misattributed to natural causes, victims who'd had some connection to Alexander, symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Extradition requests began arriving, prosecutors from multiple jurisdictions seeking to try him for crimes that might never have been connected without his arrest in Marina's case. Each new connection, each additional victim identified, added weight to the realization that Alexander Lebutkin might be one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, his body count obscured by methodology specifically designed to avoid detection. Perhaps most disturbing were the unfinished sections of his journals, pages labeled with dates in the future, names he apparently intended to target next. Marina's sister Olga appeared on this list, confirming the wisdom of her insistence on thorough investigation. She had likely saved her own life by refusing to accept convenient explanations. Other names belonged to co-workers, former classmates, even distant relatives. The chilling implication was clear. Alexander had planned to continue indefinitely, perhaps for the rest of his natural life, accumulating victims and data with the patience of someone who viewed murder as a long-term research project rather than a criminal act with moral implications. When asked directly why he'd kept such detailed records, the evidence that ultimately guaranteed his conviction, Alexander's response captured the essence of his pathology perfectly. What's the point of conducting experiments if you don't document results? The data is what matters. Without proper records, the entire exercise becomes meaningless. Even facing life imprisonment, possibly execution depending on final charges and jurisdictional decisions, he couldn't grasp why self-preservation should outweigh scientific methodology. His priorities remained fundamentally alien, his thinking pattern incompatible with normal human consciousness. The investigators weren't just dealing with a criminal. They were confronting something that wore a human shape but operated according to entirely different programming. The trial of Alexander Lebutkin became a media sensation, capturing international attention as details emerged about the scope and nature of his crimes. Courtrooms packed with journalists, victims' families, and morbidly curious observers eager to glimpse the man who turned chemistry into an instrument of mass murder. Security remained heightened throughout proceedings. Though Alexander himself posed no physical threat, he'd never used violence, had no history of aggression, remained utterly compliant with legal processes. The danger he represented was intellectual rather than physical, making him no less terrifying but infinitely more difficult to guard against. The prosecution built an overwhelming case, presenting forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Alexander's own journals to construct a narrative of systematic murder spanning years. Medical experts explained thallium poisoning in layman's terms, detailing how the tasteless, odorless compound could be administered in food or drink without the victim's knowledge, how it accumulated in tissue over time, how symptoms mimicked various common ailments until reaching lethal concentrations. They walked the jury through Marina's final months, showing how each doctor's visit, each test result, each symptom aligned perfectly with gradual poisoning. The presentation was clinical, methodical, devastating in its thoroughness. Victim impact statements brought emotional weight to scientific evidence. Olga spoke through tears about her sister's suffering, the fear in Marina's voice during their last conversation, the guilt of not understanding soon enough to intervene. Pavel Romanov's widow described years of believing her husband died from natural causes, the psychological impact of learning he'd been murdered, the violation of having grief manipulated by the person who'd caused it. Other families told similar stories: loved ones lost, lives destroyed, trust shattered by the revelation that deaths they'd accepted as tragic but natural were actually calculated homicides. The courtroom wept while Alexander sat unmoved, observing the emotional displays with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying unfamiliar customs. The defense faced an impossible task. Alexander's guilt was irrefutable, documented in his own meticulous handwriting and supported by mountains of corroborating evidence. Instead, his attorneys pursued an insanity defense, arguing that someone so profoundly disconnected from normal human emotion couldn't be held to standard legal accountability. They presented psychiatric evaluations detailing his antisocial personality disorder, his complete lack of empathy, his inability to process emotional consequences. "My client doesn't understand why what he did was wrong," his lead attorney argued. "He intellectually knows society prohibits murder, but he cannot comprehend the moral reasoning behind that prohibition. Punishing him is like punishing someone for being colorblind. You're condemning a deficit, not a choice." Prosecutors demolished this argument with ruthless efficiency. Alexander Lebutkin knew his actions were illegal. That's why he concealed them so carefully. He understood society would punish him if discovered. That's why he developed methodologies designed to avoid detection. He recognized that his victims would resist if they knew his intentions. That's why he administered poison secretly rather than openly. His journals prove he possesses the cognitive capacity to plan, to strategize, to predict consequences. What he lacks isn't understanding, it's caring. And the law doesn't excuse crimes simply because the perpetrator feels no remorse. If anything, his complete lack of conscience makes him more dangerous, not less responsible. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 7 counts of premeditated murder, multiple counts of attempted murder for victims who survived his poisoning attempts, and various charges related to possession of controlled substances and practicing chemistry without proper licensing. The speed of deliberation spoke to the overwhelming nature of evidence and the jury's collective revulsion at Alexander's crimes. When the verdict was read, victims' families sobbed with relief while Alexander received the news with the same blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial, as if the outcome was merely an interesting development rather than a life-defining judgment. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, the judge delivering a statement that balanced legal requirements with moral condemnation. "Mr. Labutkin, you have demonstrated a capacity for evil that defies comprehension. You took gifts, intelligence, education, scientific knowledge that should have been used to benefit humanity, and you twisted them into weapons against the innocent. You didn't kill in rage or passion or desperation. You killed methodically, patiently, with the cold calculation of someone conducting research. You documented suffering as data. You observed dying as experimentation. You treated human beings as laboratory specimens, unworthy of dignity or compassion. The law requires me to impose sentence based on your crimes, but no earthly punishment can adequately address the magnitude of what you've done." The judge sentenced Alexander to life imprisonment without possibility of parole on each murder count, sentences to run consecutively rather than concurrently. Even accounting for appeals and the glacial pace of the legal system, Alexander Labutkin would die in prison, his life of methodical murder ending in a cell far removed from the laboratories where he'd once practiced his gruesome craft. Additional sentences for attempted murder and related charges added decades more, though they were largely symbolic given the life terms already imposed. As bailiffs led him from the courtroom for the final time, Alexander glanced back at the gallery, his eyes sweeping across tearful families and satisfied prosecutors with the same analytical detachment he'd shown throughout. Even in defeat, even facing the rest of his life behind bars, he remained fundamentally unchanged, a void where a human soul should have been. The aftermath of the trial rippled outward in unexpected directions. Pharmaceutical companies across the region implemented new security protocols for chemical inventories, recognizing that their lax controls had enabled Alexander's crimes. Medical schools added training on recognizing poisoning symptoms, ensuring future doctors would be better equipped to identify cases current physicians had missed. Law enforcement agencies developed better systems for tracking unexplained deaths and identifying patterns that might indicate serial killers operating beneath the radar. Marina's case became a textbook example studied by homicide investigators worldwide, a reminder that the most dangerous predators aren't always the most obvious ones. But perhaps the most significant impact came in the questions Alexander's case raised about the nature of evil itself. Philosophers, psychologists, and theologians debated whether someone so profoundly lacking in empathy could be considered fully human or whether he represented something categorically different. A biological human, certainly, but one missing the essential spark that defines humanity beyond mere biology. Could true evil exist without malice? Could someone commit monstrous acts without being a monster in the traditional sense? Alexander didn't hate his victims, didn't derive pleasure from their suffering, didn't act from any emotion most people would recognize. He simply killed because human life held no value in his internal calculus, because people were objects to be used and disposed of based on convenience and curiosity. Was this evil in its purest form, or something beyond evil entirely? Survivors of Alexander's poisoning attempts, those who'd experienced symptoms but recovered before lethal doses accumulated, struggled with complex trauma. They'd been unknowingly part of experiments, their bodies violated in ways they hadn't recognized until revelation. Many reported nightmares, paranoia about food and drink, difficulty trusting others, and persistent anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms disturbingly similar to those caused by the poisoning itself. Therapy helped, but couldn't fully erase the psychological impact of learning you'd been someone's test subject, that your suffering had been observed and documented with scientific detachment. One survivor captured the horror succinctly. "I keep thinking about him watching me, taking notes about my symptoms like I was a lab rat. Every headache, every moment of weakness. He was recording it all, measuring how well his poison was working. I can't unlearn that. I can't unfeel the violation. In prison, Alexander adapted to his new environment with the same methodical efficiency he'd brought to his crimes. He established routines, avoided conflicts, spent hours in the library reading scientific journals and texts. Guards described him as the model prisoner, quiet, compliant, no disciplinary incidents. But this exemplary behavior stemmed from the same emotional deficit that had enabled his crimes. He simply didn't care enough about freedom to risk it through misbehavior, viewed cooperation as the logical strategy for maximizing comfort within available constraints. Requests for interviews flooded in from journalists, true crime writers, and academic researchers hoping to understand his psychology, but Alexander declined all media contact. His journals had said everything he cared to communicate. The rest was irrelevant. The question haunting everyone who'd touched Alexander's case remained unanswerable. How many more like him existed, operating undetected, their victims' deaths attributed to natural causes because no one thought to look for poisons? No one recognized patterns scattered across jurisdictions and years? How many seemingly natural deaths concealed careful murders? How many respectable professionals harbored similar voids where empathy should exist, biding time until opportunity aligned with impulse? The answer was unknowable, which perhaps made it more terrifying than any specific number could be. Detective Volkov, whose investigation had finally stopped Alexander's decade-long killing spree, reflected on the case during an interview years later. The hardest part wasn't solving the case. Once we suspected poison, the evidence was overwhelming. The hardest part was accepting what it revealed about human nature, or the lack thereof. Alexander looked like everyone else, functioned in society, held jobs, maintained relationships. Nothing about his exterior signaled the emptiness within. That's the real nightmare, the realization that we can't always identify predators by sight, that intelligence and education don't guarantee morality, that someone can be profoundly dangerous while appearing utterly normal. Alexander Lobutkin proved that monsters don't always have horns and fangs. Sometimes they have lab coats and briefcases. Sometimes they sit across from you at dinner. Sometimes they're sleeping beside you. And you'll never know until it's too late. Marina's sister Olga established a foundation in her sister's name, dedicated to training medical professionals on poisoning recognition and supporting families of murder victims whose cases had initially been classified as natural deaths. The work gave her purpose, transformed grief into action, but couldn't fully heal wounds Alexander had inflicted. I'll never stop wondering if I could have done more, recognized warning signs earlier, saved my sister sooner, she admitted during a foundation fundraiser. But I can make sure other families have better resources than we did, that doctors ask the right questions, that suspicious deaths receive proper investigation. It won't bring Marina back. Nothing will. But maybe it prevents the next Marina, the next victim of a predator hiding behind respectability and scientific credentials. The legacy of Alexander Lobutkin serves as permanent reminder that evil wears many faces, that intelligence absent empathy creates monsters more dangerous than strength absent restraint, and that the most terrifying predators are often the ones we never see coming. His victims deserved lives he stole with patient precision. Their families deserved truth he tried to conceal beneath layers of careful planning and scientific methodology. Justice, delivered through life sentences in a prison cell, cannot resurrect the dead or undo the trauma inflicted. But it ensures Alexander Lobutkin's experiments ended, his killing stopped, his calculated cruelty finally contained behind walls and bars where he'll spend his remaining years contemplating whether the data he collected was worth the price of everything he lost. Some monsters announce themselves with violence and rage, making their presence unmistakable. Others, like Alexander, operate in silence and shadows, killing with precision and patience, confident in their ability to avoid detection. Both are dangerous, both are evil. But the quiet ones, the methodical ones, the ones who turn profession into weapon and intelligence into murder weapon, those are the predators that should terrify us most, because they're the ones we might never identify until they've already struck. They're the ones living next door, working in the next office, sitting across the aisle at church. They're the ones who remind us that the darkness doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives on silent feet, carrying a briefcase full of poison and a mind devoid of mercy. And by the time you realize what's happening, the damage is already done. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Surgeon Who Carved Silence. Some doors should never be opened. Behind one in Dnipro, a nightmare wore a white coat. The scalpel doesn't lie, it cuts, it separates, it reveals. But in the trembling hands of Anatoly Maystruk, it became something else entirely. A conductor's baton orchestrating a symphony of screams that no one heard. This is the story of a healer who discovered that saving lives bored him, that the real thrill lurked in the space between mercy and monstrosity. Tonight, we descend into the operating theater of a man who turned his clinic into a slaughterhouse, where patients arrived seeking treatment and left as something less than human, or didn't leave at all. Dnipro, Ukraine. A city where Soviet-era apartment blocks stand like tombstones against a gray sky, where the Dnieper River cuts through the landscape like a surgical incision through flesh. The year was 2002, and desperation hung in the air like anesthetic gas. In a neighborhood where broken streetlights created pools of darkness between sagging buildings, a small medical clinic operated out of a converted residential space. The sign outside read simple Cyrillic letters announcing general medical services. Nothing remarkable, nothing alarming, but desperation makes people blind. The clinic belonged to Anatoly Maystruk, a 43-year-old surgeon whose credentials seemed legitimate enough for those who bothered to check. Stocky build, thinning hair, glasses that reflected fluorescent light in a way that obscured his eyes during conversations. He spoke softly, almost gently, with the bedside manner of someone who understood that vulnerable people needed reassurance. His prices were reasonable, suspiciously so for legitimate medical care, but in post-Soviet Ukraine, where the economy had collapsed and the healthcare system had crumbled, affordable treatment trumped suspicion every single time. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant attempting to mask something underneath, something organic and wrong. Peeling wallpaper revealed layers beneath, each one a different shade of institutional beige, as though the building itself was being slowly dissected. Patients sat in mismatched chairs, clutching referral papers or simply clutching themselves, wrapped in coats even though the radiators hissed with heat. They came for routine procedures, hernia repairs, appendectomies, gallbladder removals, simple surgeries that any competent surgeon could perform in their sleep. Maystruk didn't perform them in his sleep. He performed them wide awake, fully conscious of every deviation from standard procedure, every unnecessary incision, every experimental technique that no medical board would ever approve. Oksana Hertsenko arrived on a Tuesday evening in October. 28 years old, mother of 2, experiencing persistent abdominal pain that had intensified over several weeks. Her husband worked construction jobs when he could find them. They had no money for the city hospital, where doctors demanded bribes before even examining patients. Maystruk's clinic represented hope, or at least a gamble they could afford. The examination room was smaller than it should have been, with a surgical table that looked like it belonged in a veterinary clinic. Medical equipment lined metal shelves, some of it outdated, some of it unidentifiable. Maystruk listened to Oksana's symptoms with that gentle nod, that reassuring smile behind the reflective glasses. He diagnosed her with an ovarian cyst that required immediate removal. Without surgery, he explained, it could rupture. The consequences would be catastrophic. She signed the consent forms without reading them. The words blurred together anyway. Medical terminology, legal disclaimers, risks and complications spelled out in language designed to obscure rather than clarify. Her husband waited outside, smoking cigarettes down to the filter, each one a small prayer that his wife would emerge intact. The anesthesia took hold quickly, too quickly. Oksana felt herself sinking into darkness that had texture, weight, presence. In that twilight space between consciousness and oblivion, she heard Maystruck humming something tuneless, a sound that had no business existing in a surgical theater. The last thing she registered before everything went black was the sensation of being terribly, irreversibly wrong about trusting this place. She woke 14 hours later in a recovery room that was really just a storage closet with a cot. The pain was extraordinary, not the expected discomfort of post-surgical healing, but something deeper, something that felt like her entire abdomen had been rearranged by indifferent hands. Maystruck appeared in the doorway, still in his surgical scrubs, telling her the procedure had gone well, that she needed to rest, that her husband could take her home in a few hours. But Oksana knew. The human body knows when it has been violated beyond the boundaries of necessity. She felt it in the way her organs sat wrong inside her skin, in the way her breath caught on something that shouldn't be there. When she finally made it home and collapsed into bed, she discovered the staples holding her incision closed were crooked, uneven, applied with the care of someone closing a garbage bag. 3 days later, the infection set in. Fever spiked. The wound oozed fluid that smelled like death fermenting. At the proper hospital, the one they'd avoided because of cost, surgeons opened Oksana up again and found a catastrophe. Maystruck had removed her ovary, yes, but he'd also taken part of her intestine for no medical reason whatsoever. He'd severed tissue, cauterized incorrectly, left internal bleeding that had slowly filled her abdominal cavity. He'd performed what the attending surgeon described as exploratory mutilation. Oksana survived, but the word survived carried weight it never should have needed to carry. She was not the first. She would not be the last, because Anatoly Maystruck had discovered something about himself during his years of legitimate medical practice. Saving lives provided no satisfaction. Following procedures, adhering to ethical standards, achieving successful outcomes, all of it bored him to the edge of madness. But deviating from protocol, experimenting with living tissue, holding absolute power over unconscious bodies, that ignited something primal and ravenous inside him. His clinic became a laboratory where the subjects couldn't consent and couldn't escape. Others came before Oksana, young men seeking hernia repairs who woke up missing chunks of abdominal muscle, elderly women whose routine procedures left them with severed nerves and permanent disabilities. They complained to neighbors, to family members, to anyone who would listen. But in a society where institutions had collapsed and corruption was the only reliable constant, who would investigate one small-time surgeon running a clinic in a forgotten neighborhood? The complaints accumulated like surgical waste in a contaminated bin. A young man named Viktor Kovalenko entered Maystruck's clinic for an appendectomy and emerged with nerve damage in his legs, damage that made no anatomical sense given the location of his appendix. A middle-aged woman seeking treatment for a simple cyst left with organs rearranged, her reproductive system effectively destroyed. Each patient carried their trauma home, tried to heal, tried to forget, tried to reconcile the fact that seeking help had left them worse than before. Maystruck refined his technique with each victim. He learned which deviations caused the most interesting complications. He discovered how much he could remove before the body began shutting down. He experimented with anesthesia levels, keeping some patients in lighter states of sedation so he could observe their reactions, their involuntary movements, their subconscious attempts to escape what was being done to them. The clinic's reputation should have collapsed, should have closed. But desperation is a renewable resource in places where hope has been systematically stripped away. For every patient who emerged damaged, 3 more arrived seeking affordable treatment. The cycle perpetuated itself, feeding Maystruck's hunger, providing him with an endless supply of bodies to practice his perverse craft upon. The walls of that clinic absorbed everything. The screams that anesthesia couldn't quite suppress, the prayers whispered in the waiting room, the slow leak of blood seeping into floorboards that would never come clean. If buildings could testify, that structure would have spoken volumes about the horrors conducted within its converted residential space. But buildings stay silent, and so did Anatoly Maystruck's victims, trapped in a system that valued denial over investigation, that prioritized institutional reputation over individual suffering. until one patient refused to stay silent. Kampatamar Shankaria was not Ukrainian. He was Indian, 32 years old, working in Dnipro as part of a pharmaceutical company's regional office. His presence in Ukraine was temporary, a 2-year assignment that would boost his resume and provide financial security for his family back home. He lived in a modest apartment, learned rudimentary Russian, navigated the city's post-Soviet landscape with the cautious optimism of someone who believed hard work and good intentions would see him through. In March 2003, Shankaria began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Initially, he attributed it to stress, poor diet, the adjustment to Ukrainian cuisine. But the pain intensified, became constant, began radiating into his back and chest. Colleagues at work noticed him wincing, gripping the edge of his desk, breathing through waves of discomfort that left him pale and sweating. The company's health insurance would have covered treatment at a private hospital, but Shankaria was frugal, sending most of his salary home to support his parents and younger siblings. When a coworker mentioned Maystruck's clinic, cheap, efficient, no bureaucratic nonsense, Shankaria saw an opportunity to save money while addressing a problem that had become unbearable. He arrived at the clinic on a Wednesday evening after work, still wearing his business casual attire. The waiting room was emptier than usual, just an elderly man clutching his side and a young woman who wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Maystruck greeted Shankaria with that same gentle manner, that reassuring smile, those reflective glasses that turned his eyes into mirrors. The examination was cursory. Maystruck pressed Shankaria's abdomen in several places, asked questions about the pain's location and intensity, then delivered his diagnosis with confident finality. Appendicitis. Not acute, not yet life-threatening, but requiring immediate surgical intervention before complications developed. The procedure was routine, Maystruck explained. An hour under anesthesia, a small incision, removal of the inflamed appendix, then recovery and home within 24 hours. Shankaria hesitated. Something about the clinic felt wrong, not overtly dangerous, but off in ways his instincts registered without his conscious mind understanding. The equipment looked dated. The examination room smelled strange. Maystruck's smile never quite reached his eyes, reflecting in those glasses like twin surgical lamps illuminating a theater of operations. But pain is a powerful motivator, and Shankaria's pain had become excruciating. He signed the consent forms, paid the fee in cash, and followed Maystruck into the surgical suite. The anesthesia came fast and dark, swallowing him whole. What happened during the next 4 hours would only be reconstructed later, through medical examinations and forensic analysis. While Shankaria lay unconscious, Maystruck performed an appendectomy, but he didn't stop there. He made additional incisions, explored areas of Shankaria's abdomen that had nothing to do with appendicitis. He removed sections of tissue for no medical reason. He sutured blood vessels in ways that compromised circulation. He essentially used Shankaria's body as a canvas for surgical experimentation, pushing boundaries, testing limits, satisfying hungers that had nothing to do with healing. When Shankaria woke, the pain was apocalyptic. Not post-surgical discomfort, but something fundamental and wrong, as though his entire torso had been disassembled and reassembled incorrectly. Maystruck appeared beside the cot, offering painkillers that wouldn't touch this level of agony, explaining that some discomfort was normal, that healing took time. But Shankaria knew. He'd undergone surgery before, minor procedures back in India, and this was nothing like normal recovery. This was trauma. This was damage. This was catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. He demanded to see the surgical notes. Maystruck refused, citing patient confidentiality regulations that made no sense in this context. Shankaria tried to stand, to leave, to get to a proper hospital, but his legs wouldn't support him. The pain folded him in half. He collapsed back onto the cot, consciousness flickering, body screaming. Maystruck watched with clinical detachment. No concern, no alarm, just observation, as though Shankaria's suffering was data to be collected rather than a human experience requiring intervention. 12 hours later, Shankaria's colleagues found him. He'd managed to send a text message, barely coherent, just the clinic's address and the word help repeated 3 times. They arrived in a borrowed car, found him in that storage closet recovery room, still lying on the cot, fever burning through him, infection spreading through his abdomen like wildfire through dry grass. They didn't ask permission. They carried Shankaria out of that clinic, loaded him into the car, and drove directly to Dnipro's Central Hospital. Emergency room doctors took one look at him, the fever, the distended abdomen, the incision that oozed pus and blood, and rushed him into emergency surgery. What they found inside him was carnage. Maystruck had removed Shankaria's appendix, yes, but he'd also severed portions of intestine, damaged the peritoneum, created internal bleeding that had been slowly filling the abdominal cavity for hours. The surgical team worked through the night, removing necrotic tissue, repairing blood vessels, trying to salvage what Maystruck had destroyed. Shankaria survived barely. The hospital stay stretched into weeks. Infection after infection ravaged his system. His body weight dropped precipitously. Surgeons performed 3 additional operations to repair the damage, each one peeling back another layer of Maystruck's butchery. But Shankaria did something that previous victims hadn't done. He filed a police report, not a complaint, not a civil lawsuit, a criminal report alleging assault, mutilation, and attempted murder. The Indian embassy got involved. Shankaria's employer, a multinational corporation with resources and connections, pushed for investigation. Suddenly, Maystruck's clinic wasn't just another sketchy medical operation in a forgotten neighborhood. It became the focus of official scrutiny, the kind that couldn't be deflected with bribes or bureaucratic maneuvering. Police detectives arrived at the clinic on a rainy April morning. Maystruck was mid-procedure, standing over an unconscious patient, scalpel in hand. He looked up at the officers entering his surgical suite with an expression that mixed annoyance and confusion, as though they'd interrupted something important rather than discovered something monstrous. They arrested him on the spot, handcuffed him while still in surgical scrubs, led him out past the waiting room where 2 patients sat, oblivious that they'd just been spared from becoming the next entries in Maystruck's catalog of mutilation. The clinic was sealed. Forensic teams moved in, collecting evidence, documenting the horrors hidden in plain sight. What they discovered was staggering: medical records showing dozens of botched procedures, surgical tools that hadn't been properly sterilized in months, tissue samples stored in jars like trophies, and journals, handwritten journals where Maystruck had documented his experiments with chilling clinical detachment. He'd kept notes, detailed observations of how patients reacted to different types of unauthorized procedures, sketches of incisions and removals, theories about pain thresholds and the body's capacity to endure trauma. It read like the documentation of a scientist conducting legitimate research, except the subjects were unwilling, the procedures were torture, and the purpose was purely sadistic gratification. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives tracked down previous patients, interviewed them, examined medical records. Victim after victim emerged from the shadows, carrying scars both physical and psychological. The true scope of Maystruck's crimes became horrifyingly clear. Over a 3-year period, he'd mutilated at least 47 patients, possibly more. Some had died from infections or complications, their deaths attributed to natural causes or medical mishaps rather than intentional harm. Maystruck's arrest made regional headlines. Television news showed footage of the sealed clinic, of police carrying boxes of evidence, of Shankaria being wheeled into court to testify, still recovering, still bearing the physical evidence of what one man with a medical degree and a broken conscience could inflict upon the vulnerable. The trial would take months to prepare. The evidence was overwhelming, but prosecuting a doctor for crimes committed under the guise of medical treatment presented unique challenges. Where did malpractice end and murder begin? How could the legal system address systematic mutilation that occurred in a space designed for healing? Those questions would be answered. Justice would be pursued. But first, the full horror had to be acknowledged. Every victim had to be heard. Every crime had to be documented. And the man who'd turned his clinic into a chamber of torments had to face exactly what he'd done to people who trusted him with their most vulnerable selves. The courtroom in Dnipro's regional administrative building filled beyond capacity. Victims occupied the gallery, some still recovering from surgeries required to repair Maystruck's damage. Their bodies told stories that transcended words. The way they moved carefully, protecting incisions that hadn't healed properly. The pain that flashed across faces when they shifted position. Journalists crowded the press section, cameras trained on the defendant's table where Anatoly Maystruck sat, flanked by court-appointed attorneys who'd drawn the worst assignment of their careers. Maystruck looked diminished, smaller somehow, as though being removed from his clinic had drained him of the power he'd wielded there. He wore civilian clothes, a cheap suit that hung poorly on his stocky frame. His glasses still reflected courtroom lights, still obscured his eyes during testimony, still created the impression of a man looking everywhere except directly at his victims. The prosecution built its case methodically, brick by evidentiary brick. They began with Kampatamar Shankaria, the patient whose refusal to stay silent had triggered the investigation. Shankaria testified from a wheelchair, still too weak to stand for extended periods. He described the pain that had driven him to seek treatment, the reassurance Maystruck had offered, the catastrophic aftermath of what should have been a routine appendectomy. Medical experts presented their findings. Internal damage that served no therapeutic purpose, organ tissue removed without justification, surgical techniques that violated every standard of care. They displayed images, slides showing the state of Shankaria's abdomen when emergency surgeons had opened him up, the infection spreading through tissue, the unnecessary incisions that had turned his torso into a battlefield. The courtroom reacted with visible revulsion. Jurors looked away. Spectators gasped. Even the judge, a veteran of decades on the bench, required a recess after viewing the evidence. But Shankaria was only the beginning. The prosecution called victim after victim, each one adding another layer to the portrait of systematic brutality. Oksana Hertsenko described waking from surgery feeling fundamentally violated, the infection that nearly killed her, the permanent damage to her reproductive system. Viktor Kovalenko demonstrated how nerve damage in his legs had destroyed his ability to work construction, how a simple hernia repair had left him disabled and destitute. One by one, they testified. Each story was unique in its details but identical in its core. Trust betrayed, bodies violated, lives permanently altered by a man who'd taken an oath to do no harm and then spent 3 years doing nothing but. The defense attempted to argue medical malpractice rather than criminal intent. Maystruck's attorneys presented him as an overworked surgeon operating under difficult conditions, making honest mistakes rather than committing deliberate crimes. They cited the lack of resources in post-Soviet Ukraine, the crumbling healthcare infrastructure, the impossible pressure placed on medical professionals. Maystruck had tried his best, they argued. He'd failed, yes, but failure wasn't murder. The prosecution destroyed that narrative with surgical precision. They introduced Maystruck's journals, those handwritten records documenting experimental procedures, noting patient reactions, sketching unauthorized incisions. The entries read like research documentation, complete with hypotheses, observations, and conclusions. One passage described how removing a section of a patient's small intestine produced fascinating complications in digestive function that merit further investigation. Another detailed the effects of partial nerve severance, noting that motor function degradation occurs more rapidly than anticipated. These were not the notes of a doctor making mistakes under pressure. These were the records of a predator conducting experiments on human subjects, treating unconscious patients as laboratory specimens rather than people. Expert witnesses in psychology and criminal behavior testified about sadistic personality disorder, about individuals who derive satisfaction from inflicting suffering, about the particular pathology of medical professionals who exploited their position to harm rather than heal. They explained how Maystruck's behavior fit patterns seen in other cases of medical serial killing, the escalation, the experimentation, the complete disregard for patient welfare. The most damning evidence came from forensic examination of the clinic itself. Investigators had found tissue samples stored in jars, labeled with dates and brief descriptions. Maystruck had been keeping souvenirs, physical evidence of his crimes, preserved like trophies. Some samples had no connection to any documented surgical procedure, suggesting victims who'd never been identified, crimes that remained uncounted in the official tally. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors displayed photograph after photograph of those jars, each one containing a piece of someone who'd trusted Maystruck with their care. The visual impact was devastating. This wasn't malpractice. This was collection. This was a man who'd found pleasure in cutting people apart and keeping pieces of them as mementos. Maystruck's demeanor throughout the trial remained eerily detached. He showed no visible emotion during victim testimony, no reaction to the medical evidence, no shame when prosecutors displayed his journals. He sat motionless, hands folded on the defendant's table, occasionally conferring with his attorneys in whispers that no one else could hear. When the defense finally called him to testify in his own behalf, the courtroom leaned forward in collective anticipation. What could he possibly say? What explanation could exist for what he'd done? Maystruck took the stand calmly, adjusted his reflective glasses, and began speaking in that same soft, gentle voice he'd used to reassure patients before violating them. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made. He expressed regret that patients had suffered. He insisted that his intentions had always been to provide medical care to people who had nowhere else to turn. But he never admitted to deliberate harm. He framed every unauthorized procedure as an attempt to thoroughly address underlying issues. He described removing healthy tissue as preventive medicine. He characterized nerve damage and organ destruction as unfortunate complications rather than intentional outcomes. The prosecution cross-examined him with relentless focus, forcing him to explain specific entries in his journals, specific procedures that had no possible medical justification. Maystruck's explanations became increasingly convoluted, contradicting medical science, defying logical reasoning. He claimed that traditional surgical techniques were insufficient, that he'd been developing new approaches, that his methods would eventually be recognized as innovative rather than criminal. The courtroom recognized the testimony for what it was, the rationalization of a predator who'd convinced himself that his sadism was science, that his violations were breakthroughs, that the screams he'd caused were data points in a research project only he understood. The prosecution's closing argument was brief and devastating. They didn't need theatrical flourishes or emotional appeals. The evidence spoke with deafening clarity. 47 victims, 3 years of systematic mutilation. A clinic that had functioned as a torture chamber disguised as a place of healing. A man who'd betrayed every principle of medicine and humanity. The defense's closing argument struggled to find footing. They returned to themes of intent, context, the difficulty of proving deliberate harm versus professional incompetence. But their words sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence, the testimonies of broken patients, the jars of preserved tissue that sat as exhibits on the prosecution's table. Jury deliberation lasted 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict in a steady voice that betrayed no emotion. Guilty on all 47 counts of aggravated assault, guilty on 16 counts of grievous bodily harm, guilty on 3 counts of attempted murder. The courtroom erupted. Victims wept. Some from relief, others from the vindication of finally being believed. Maystruck sat motionless, showing no reaction to the verdicts, as though his conviction was happening to someone else entirely. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge delivered a scathing statement, describing Maystruck as a predator who'd exploited the vulnerable, who'd betrayed the trust inherent in the doctor-patient relationship, who'd caused irreparable harm to dozens of people whose only crime was seeking medical care they couldn't afford elsewhere. The sentence, 23 years in maximum security prison, with no possibility of parole. Maystruck would be 70 years old before he could potentially walk free. The judge added a final note. Maystruck's medical license was permanently revoked, and he was forever prohibited from practicing medicine or working in any healthcare capacity. The tools he'd used to harm would never touch another patient. Maystruck was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his reflection-blocked glasses finally removed, his eyes visible for the first time throughout the entire proceedings. They were remarkably ordinary, brown, slightly tired, completely unremarkable. The eyes of a monster who looked like anyone else. Dnipro moved on, as cities do, but the scars lingered. The building that had housed Maystruck's clinic remained sealed for months, becoming a landmark of local horror, a place parents warned children away from with hushed explanations that something very bad had happened there. Eventually, the property was sold, renovated, converted into a small grocery store. But neighborhood residents never quite forgot what those walls had witnessed, what floors had absorbed. For Maystruck's victims, moving on proved impossible. Physical recovery was only the beginning of a longer, darker journey. Oksana Hertsenko underwent 3 additional surgeries to repair the damage to her reproductive system, but doctors ultimately determined she would never be able to have more children. The 2 she already had would be her only ones, and the knowledge that this limitation had been imposed by a man who'd promised to help her created a bitterness that no amount of counseling could fully dissolve. Viktor Kovalenko never regained full function in his legs. The nerve damage proved permanent, leaving him with a shuffling gait and constant pain that required medication to manage. Construction work, the only trade he knew, became impossible. He filed for disability benefits, navigated bureaucratic nightmares, eventually found work doing basic accounting for a small business. But every morning when he struggled to walk from bedroom to bathroom, he thought about Maystruck, about the simple hernia repair that had destroyed his life's trajectory. Kampatamar Shankaria completed his recovery in India, evacuated by his employer once doctors cleared him for travel. The physical healing took months, but the psychological impact proved more enduring. He developed severe medical anxiety, avoiding doctors even for routine checkups, convinced that any interaction with healthcare professionals could lead to betrayal. His career suffered, his relationships strained. The young man who'd arrived in Ukraine optimistic and ambitious returned home diminished, carrying trauma that manifested in nightmares and hypervigilance. The Indian embassy lodged formal complaints, and Ukraine's government issued apologies, promises of reform, assurances that such atrocities would never happen again. But those words rang hollow for the 47 people whose bodies bore permanent evidence that such atrocities had indeed happened, that monsters could wear white coats and operate with impunity until someone with resources and connections refused to suffer in silence. Maystruck himself vanished into Ukraine's prison system. He was transferred to a maximum security facility outside Kiev, where he lived among violent criminals, murderers, and others society had determined were too dangerous for freedom. Reports from correctional officers described him as a model prisoner. Quiet, compliant, spending most of his time reading medical journals and textbooks he was somehow able to access. He petitioned multiple times for permission to provide basic medical consultation to fellow inmates, arguing that his expertise shouldn't go to waste even while incarcerated. Every petition was denied. The prison administration wasn't about to give Anatoly Maystruck access to vulnerable bodies ever again, regardless of how sanitized the context. He rarely received visitors. No family members came. His parents had died before his arrest, and he'd never married or had children. Occasionally, journalists requested interviews, hoping to gain insight into the psychology of a medical predator, to understand what drove a healer to become a torturer. Maystruck declined most requests. The few interviews he did grant revealed nothing of substance. He spoke in generalities, expressed vague regrets, never admitted to the deliberate nature of his crimes. One psychologist who interviewed him as part of a research project on criminal medical professionals described Maystruck as profoundly disconnected from the humanity of his victims. He could discuss surgical procedures in clinical detail, could explain techniques and complications, but when asked about the people he'd harmed, his language became abstract. They weren't individuals with families, dreams, lives. They were cases, subjects, data points in a research project that existed only in his fractured mind. The broader medical community grappled with uncomfortable questions. How had Maystruck operated for 3 years without intervention? What systemic failures allowed a predator to maintain a medical practice despite mounting evidence of harm? Ukraine's medical licensing board faced intense scrutiny, forced to confront how thoroughly their oversight systems had failed. Reforms were implemented. Stricter clinic inspections, mandatory reporting requirements for surgical complications, easier pathways for patients to file complaints. But those changes came too late for the 47 people whose bodies had been sacrificed on the altar of bureaucratic negligence and systemic collapse. Support groups formed among Maystruck's victims. They met monthly in a community center in Dnipro, sharing stories, offering solidarity, trying to rebuild lives that had been irrevocably altered. The meetings were difficult, opening wounds, reliving trauma, confronting the reality that their suffering had been preventable. But they also provided something essential: validation that their pain was real, that what had been done to them was wrong, that they deserved acknowledgement and support. Oksana became a fierce advocate for patient rights, testifying before legislative committees, pushing for stronger protections, ensuring that her violation might prevent others from experiencing similar horrors. She carried photographs of her children to every testimony, reminding lawmakers that behind every statistic was a human being with a family, with a future that had been stolen or diminished by someone who'd sworn to do no harm. The clinic building, despite its conversion to a grocery store, never fully shed its reputation. Locals avoided it when possible, choosing to shop elsewhere even if it meant traveling farther. The new owners struggled with the stigma, eventually selling to a developer who demolished the entire structure and built something new. But even that couldn't erase memory. Older residents still referred to the location as where that doctor's place was. The specifics left unspoken but universally understood. Maystruck aged in prison, hair graying, body weakening under the weight of years and confinement. He developed health problems, diabetes, hypertension, the predictable decline of a man entering his 60s behind bars. Ironically, he received medical care from other doctors, other professionals who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Those treating physicians maintained professionalism, provided necessary care, but the interactions must have carried dark irony. A medical predator now dependent on the mercy of colleagues who viewed him with disgust. He would die in prison, most likely. 23 years was a long sentence for a man in his 40s when incarcerated. The mathematics of aging suggested he'd be elderly if he ever saw freedom, and even then, he'd emerge into a world that knew his name, knew his crimes, would never let him forget or escape what he'd done. But dying in prison would be mercy compared to what his victims experienced. They couldn't escape their bodies, couldn't serve a sentence, and then walk free from the damage he'd inflicted. They carried his crimes in nerve damage and surgical scars, in reproductive systems destroyed and careers ended, in nightmares that jerked them awake decades after his conviction. The story of Anatoly Maystruck became a cautionary tale in medical schools across Ukraine and beyond. Students studied it not just as a lesson in ethics, but as a warning about what happens when medicine divorces itself from humanity, when the power inherent in the doctor-patient relationship becomes a tool for exploitation rather than healing. Professors used the case to illustrate how small deviations from ethical practice can escalate into systematic abuse, how rationalization can transform sadism into science in the mind of a predator. Kempadamar Shankaria eventually wrote about his experience, publishing an essay in an Indian medical journal about the importance of patient advocacy and the vulnerabilities created by economic desperation. He didn't mention Maystruck by name, but the details were unmistakable. The essay ended with a plea for healthcare systems worldwide to prioritize accessibility and safety equally, to ensure that cost never becomes a factor that drives patients into the hands of predators. The scalpel doesn't lie. Cuts, it separates, it reveals. In Anatoly Maystruck's hands, it revealed the darkest possibilities of a profession built on trust, the horror that emerges when healing becomes hunting, when the vulnerable become prey. His clinic is gone, demolished, replaced by structures that serve legitimate purposes. But the memory persists, in the bodies of survivors, in the reforms those bodies inspired, in the eternal vigilance required to prevent the next monster from wearing a white coat and calling violence medicine. Some doors should never be opened. Behind one in Dnipro, a nightmare wore a white coat and called itself a doctor. 47 people learned too late that the greatest danger sometimes comes from those we trust to make us whole. The surgeon who carved silence is now silenced himself, locked away where his hands can never harm again. But the screams he created still echo. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.